Graeme Sait is an author and educator responsible for hundreds of published articles, a popular book entitled Nutrition Rules, and a highly successful podcast. The Nutrition Farming Podcast ranks among the most popular of agricultural podcasts in multiple countries. His Nutrition Matters blog has tens of thousands of subscribers, and his TED Talk, Humus Saves the World, has over 300,000 views. Graeme is the founder of leading Australian company NTS, and he has formulated all their 200 plus unique products. He has also developed and teaches the internationally acclaimed Certificate of Nutrition Farming course. He has trained over 40,000 farmers and consultants on 4 continents over the last 25 years with his popular course. Graeme shares his expertise in human, plant, and animal nutrition, and his health and longevity lectures are popular across the globe. Graeme often consults at the government level in Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. He has been responsible for the successful conversion of a large supermarket chain in South Africa to biological food production. Graeme is a sought-after conference presenter, addressing a wide range of professionals ranging from farmers to soil scientists and environmentalists. His inspirational presentations are often described as life-changing. Welcome, Graeme. And if Cherian wants to say a few words, Cherian, please go ahead. Otherwise, we can have Graeme begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Once again, welcome, Graeme, and welcome all the participants to this webinar. Like I mentioned a little while ago, we are in a crossroads. What was a challenge for us in the Indian subcontinent for most of the agri-commodities? If price and cost was a challenge for 5 years back or 7 years back, today we are also very badly hit with the weather change and related issues. And very often the weather change issues have been addressed directly to the plant by plant protection methods. But then we need to gain a lot of knowledge and do a lot more to the soil and its management in order to combat the weather change and its ill effects. Like I mentioned earlier, the biggest challenge for tea currently is the rise in the sucking pest population, tea mosquito bug, and the related the new modified versions of the pest which is coming in, and also the blister blight and its secondary infections of grey blight, etc. So these are really affecting the crop apart from the weather change. So we really look forward to get your inputs to see how we can improve. And I'm sure this is going to be very exciting because what I've seen physically from Nagpur and also what I heard from Jeffrey and other colleagues from the coffee industry, we are really keen and looking forward to hear from you, Mr. Sait. For the general knowledge for everybody, I would suggest when the Graeme Sait presents the presentation, we shall hear it, and if there are any questions, let's put it on the chat, and I shall capture all of that, and towards the end, we'll answer the question one after the other, what is there in the chat. If anybody wants to add anything towards later than that, we can do that. But then order of priority will be to those people who have put in the chats, and which will be, we'll request Graeme Sait to address that. If that is fine with all of you, we can get going.
Okay, thank you, Cherian.
Welcome.
It's a great pleasure. Ready to go? Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've not been able to travel to India since COVID. It was, at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, traveling to your country and really enjoying the visits. But that's ground to a halt for the last 2 or 3 years, and I haven't really. That led me to begin my podcast because I couldn't get out and share the word, and I sort of wonder why I didn't do a podcast earlier, because it's such a tremendous way to share knowledge. The Nutrition Farming Podcast has many hundreds of thousands of listens, and essentially it's really, listening to me is often described as drinking from the fire hose, because there's such a huge flood of information. And the sweet spot for podcasts is 45 minutes. Well, mine is between 3.5 and 4 hours long, and you'd think that would put people off, but it doesn't, because there's a tremendous amount of knowledge, and the podcast continues to grow. I think it's in 79 countries now. So that's a good, if there's some ideas that you're interested in after this, 90 minutes that we have here for this presentation, feel free to it's on all of the podcast services to listen, and you'll get much more information in that way. So we'll get started. And my company began with the kind of life-changing scenario where my young daughter was hit by a car and lay in a coma for 3 months, and she was, people were asking us to turn the machines off on a daily basis because she had terrible brain damage, but we refused. And 3 months into that, sitting beside her bed, which can be quite life-changing when someone's in a coma and you're sitting beside them for that time, all the machines started beeping, and they said this is the end of her journey. This is brain death approaching. And so I prayed, which I don't normally do, but I did. I prayed and I said that if she should survive against the odds, then I would do something of value with the rest of my life. And, I've been very successful in business. I've got a couple of degrees, and the business had nothing to do with soil, but I had a developing embryonic passion for soil health and plant health. And so 20 minutes after making that prayer, Rachel, my daughter, came out of the coma. She made headlines across Australia as this miracle child. No one could explain it. I had a sleepless night and decided that I would become an expert in soil, plant, animal, and human nutrition, and that I'd form a company and I'd take it multinational and spread the word. And that's what I've been doing for almost 30 years. So I've sort of kept my word. So basically, what I've tried to develop is something I've termed nutrition farming. It's an integrated, holistic system where we recognize that everything's interrelated, that there are profound links between soil health, crop resilience, animal vitality, farmers' health. I see that being just as important. And of course, more recently, the recognition of the relationship between soil health and planetary health. I'll just click this over. So what started as something of a, just sort this out. What started as something of a trickle of interest in this kind of regenerative approach some almost 30 years ago has become something of a revolution. Most people acknowledge now that there is a sort of regenerative revolution happening. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the change, I've been training over the last few years some of the largest food producing groups on the planet, the Dole Corporation, who thought they were the largest at 6.4 billion, but Greenyard Farms, who are a Belgium-based organisation, are 6.8 billion. And I've trained both of those several times. Driscoll's Berries are the largest berry producers on the planet. What's interesting about Driscoll's Berries is that they are 3.5 billion, but 1.5 billion is organic. So they're certified organic for 1.5 billion of production. And what's interesting about that is that last year, their organic division out-yielded their conventional division. We're not talking about higher premiums. And of course, you must have recognized the interest in organic tea. It's getting huge globally. It's almost been demanded in some regions now. But this isn't, this is not higher premiums. Of course, there is higher premiums, but this is actually more yield, 9% more yield in the organic division. And that's, really an understanding that's beginning to come through, that the old school concept that you fell on your knees and sacrificed when you couldn't use chemicals is total nonsense. It's just a different road to Rome. And with this new sort of understanding, you've got to learn, farmers have got to learn how to walk that road. And there's no reason at all that you should do less production in an organic system. There's just different tools you can use, and you need learn how to use those tools. And Driscoll's are a prime example. In fact, Driscoll's plan is to be 3.5 billion of complete organics within 5 years. And why wouldn't you? You're doing better with the organic division. I've been training agriculture departments, meeting with agricultural ministers, as mentioned, training the supermarket chain called Woolworths in South Africa, who have converted to something called farming for the future based on this regenerative approach. So there's a lot of changes happening. I'll just get this to move on. I'll just see if I can. Won't be a moment. So basically, what you might call conventional agriculture, I refer to as the chemical experiment. It's really just been 10 decades that we've employed this chemical extractive model for our food production and for our problem solving. Now, that whole experiment began with a guy called Justus von Liebig, a very famous German chemist of his time, who took some plant matter, burnt it, and you get 5% of that matter becomes ash, and then the ash contains the minerals that grew that crop or that are present in the soil and or present in the plant. And he analyzed that ash and determined that the predominant minerals in that ash were nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And he announced to the world that there were armaments factories lying free and dormant at that point that could be utilized to produce NPK fertilizers. And so instead of all of the things that we'd done previously, we started putting our nutrition on from a bag. But in recognition of the fact that the first cell that oozed from the Precambrian ocean contained 74 minerals, and we're increasingly discovering that there are no accidents in a perfect blueprint called nature, everything is required, and we're increasingly recognizing some of the more obscure trace minerals and their role in plant growth. Sorry, I just have a mouthful here. But every time you remove a crop from the soil, you're removing a little bit of that full spectrum of minerals. And previously, you were recycling a great deal of that with the integration of animals in the model and green manure crops and spelling fields and putting animal manures back into the scenario. And now we started putting it on from a bag, taking off 74 things and putting back 3 initially. So it really was a case of dumbing down nutrition. And it wasn't long until, if you look back, and I have, it was 12 to 15 years after sort of widespread adoption of this simplistic nutrition that we started to see a great deal of increase in pest and disease pressure. And of course, that wasn't a mistake. And so rather than saying, is it related to nutrition, scientists stepped up to the plate and we began developing chemicals to solve our problems. And the problem with that model is that every year, last year was an increase in 14.7%. The previous year, 14.4% of total chemicals sold globally. The year before that, 14.1, 13.9, 13.6, 13.2. Every year for 10 decades, more and more chemicals applied into the scenario, as you guys are experiencing currently with your tea crops. But the problem is, wait for it, less and less response. So we're putting more and more on each year, and we're getting more and more pest and disease pressure. And that's a global model. That's a definition of the unsustainability of a symptom treating model. So it's time that we got back to root causes. That's what this whole thing is about. So there's a whole range of drivers for this wake-up call that's driving this regenerative revolution, including that simple fact that we're putting more and more chemicals on. There's research into children and finding accumulations of farm chemicals in their tissues, in their blood, in their urine, and so forth. There's a huge issue relative to, other than the climate change challenge, there's also a massive issue relative to our current rate of topsoil loss, which is 7 to 12 tonnes per hectare per year, which has been amplified with the extremes associated with climate change. And at that rate, according to one of the world's leading soil scientists, who's Indian, he's Professor Ratan Lal, he tells us we've got now 55 years and there's no topsoil left anywhere at that rate. And of course, we need to recognize how precious. That's the thin veil that feeds us, literally. We can't replace it. It's more precious than any other commodity. And we need a soil restoration initiative at governmental level yesterday. It is a really serious issue. And when we ask the question, how and why did we lose so much topsoil and why are we continuing to lose so much, a large part of that story is our loss of organic matter, because we've gone from 5% organic matter globally since 1860 down to 1.5% average. And that's very much how we've farmed our soils. And organic matter is the glue that holds that soil together. When our rivers run brown, when dust storms coat the entire eastern seaboard of Australia, as they did a few years ago, that's about the loss of the glue that holds together that soil. So it's a huge story. And then more recently, we started looking more closely at soil life. And there's a whole range of scientific endeavors that are exploring that vast diversity of soil life. And what we've seen is decimation of many key creatures. The most obvious of those most farmers know about, and that's earthworms. If you ask the question in a room full of farmers in almost in any country, how many earthworms do you have left in your soil? There are very few hands that rise. Most people have lost, most of them, they might have 1 or 2, but they've lost They can all remember their grandfather working the soil a generation or two back when there were huge flocks of birds following to eat those worms, and they're simply not present. That's the visible part of this vastly important community called the soil food web. But when we start looking at less visible components, particularly beneficial fungi, we find huge decimation. And fungi are massively important for a whole range of reasons. One of them, of course, is called mycorrhizal fungi. And that's this creature that burrows into the plant root and expands out and gives us a 10-fold increase in surface area of the roots. It produces biochemicals to stimulate plant immunity. It mines immobile minerals like phosphate and zinc and so forth. Tremendous. And more importantly, it was discovered that the most common strain of mycorrhizal fungi, called the glomeller strains, produces a substance, a sticky carbon-based substance called glomalin, which we now understand is responsible for 30% of all humus production. So it's a triggering mechanism to get the rest of the soil fixing humus. So it's huge from that perspective. And what's huge is that we've lost 90% of our mycorrhizal fungi. So they're probably the most important single creature involved in basically averting a climate change disaster. If we were going to narrow it down to one species, mycorrhizal fungi are hugely important in that equation, as they're responsible for 30% of all humus, and we've knocked out 90% of them. So there's a huge need to bring these organisms back and then to change the things that knocked them out in the first place. There's no point bringing them back and continuing with the same behavior that created the problem in the first place. We're seeing multiple studies now showing this, that our food is a shadow of what it used to be. And of course, there's a direct link between that food and nutrition. The World Health Organization, in a study called Plant Nutrition and Disease, found that they couldn't find a major degenerative disease in that 7-year study that didn't have a direct link to nutrition. So it's a major story that we've got less nutrition in our food because we've got less nutrition in our soil, less soil biology, and so forth. When we do look at our challenge to the climate change challenge, the climate change issue, we find that we're the largest contributors, 25, not the largest, but with the 25% of the world's CO2, which is actually the third largest contributor behind coal-fired power stations and concrete making of all things. And we're number 3 with 25% of the CO2 comes from agriculture, 60% of the methane and 80% of the nitrous oxide. Now, that's quite important because a nitrous oxide, you might say, well, it's only 5% of the pie, and it is. It's 5.2% of the pie, but it's 310 times more thickening of that blanket that traps the heat and changes the world. It's 310 times more thickening than CO2. So it's really important. Farmers really can make a huge difference in terms of nitrogen management. Doesn't mean you can't use nitrogen. It means you've got to learn how to use it much more efficiently than we've been currently doing. The reality is, if we were to reduce CO2 emissions by tomorrow morning by 100%, what would happen? Well, in 200 years' time, we'd be down to the CO2 levels that we had in 1975, which is considered to be too high. The oceans continue to heat, the oceans continue to acidify, and you might say, is it all over bar the shouting? It's not, and our saviour is agriculture. If we look at that potential contribution of agriculture, we find that if you look at just American soils, for example, and you built 1.1% organic matter in just their cultivated soils, that accounts for an increase in a sequestration of 4.5 billion tonnes from their 8.2 billion that they produce each year. And that's more than what's needed to save the day. So the understanding, and this is why a lot of these very large corporate agricultural organizations have started to look at this approach, because building humus is a biological process, and it's very clear from a business perspective that anything that's detrimental to that process will be viewed as unacceptable, will be legislated against, as many countries have started to do at some point. And so you really need to understand how this regenerative approach works, or you're going to be playing catch up. That's what the strategic advisors of these large companies have been telling them, and that's why they're coming to learn this approach. So the bottom line and the base concept, and it's time that we stopped treating symptoms. Now, we've done that in veterinary science, agriculture science, and of course, medical science, forever. If we look at medical science, we see that the largest killer on the planet is heart disease. The second largest killer is cancer, will take over from heart disease by the end of this year. The third largest killer used to be stroke. The third largest killer is now prescription medicine. Stroke is number 4. That's an indication. That's a symptom or an indication of the bankruptcy of just treating symptoms and not getting back to the root causes. It's not a bad luck when you get a fungal disease. There's a reason for it. It's not bad luck when you get cancer. There's always a reason, and that reason very, very commonly is linked to nutrition and whether or not you got that nutrition right. So we're going to talk about getting back to root causes. One of the starting points is to have a good soil test and to understand that there's a specific balance that determines profitability. So a good soil test will tell you that, and we offer a test in India via the American laboratory, Brookside Laboratories, that will give you that indication of where you're at from a balance perspective and how you can address that. Of course, this is Professor Mulder's chart you can see up on the board at the moment, and that's just an indication of the interplay between minerals. No mineral is an island. Every mineral impacts positively or negatively. The solid line running from one mineral to another and the arrow pointing in that direction relates to antagonism of one mineral to another. If there's too much of one, it'll antagonize the uptake of another. The broken line relates to stimulation. We know that magnesium, for example, stimulates phosphorus uptake. We know that boron can stimulate calcium uptake and so forth. So it's a handy little tool to sort of understand why your soil tests don't necessarily correlate with your leaf tests, because it's all about too much of one thing can impact the uptake of another. So if we look simply at this pie chart here, for example, we see everything, this is just relative to antagonism. And we see, for example, in the orange quarter, we can see there that if you've got too much calcium, it affects the uptake of magnesium, potassium, ammonium, nitrogen, and sodium. If you've got too much potassium, for example, it'll affect calcium and magnesium uptake. Each of these minerals in this quartile will affect the other minerals in that quartile if there's an excess. High sulfur, because you put on too much gypsum, for example, can affect phosphorus uptake and so forth. So it's just a handy little tool to understand how your soil is working in terms of those relationships. And of course, another very simple concept, and we can't quite see the bottom of the chart because we've got our photos up there, but this is just the relationship between soil pH, and we're talking pH, water pH, not calcium chloride. So that's about 1 point below water pH. So what we're seeking, if we look at that pH chart, we see that the width of the bar is the amount of that mineral that's entering your crop to provide nutrition and resilience to that crop. And we see that at 6.4, the bar is the widest the entire way down. And basically, that's the ideal soil pH. 6.4 water, which is about 5.5, and calcium chloride is where you want to be. Now, some of the tea soils are significantly more acidic than that, and I consider that to be a program. There's a false notion that acidity is good for tea, and it's actually nonsense, and I'll talk through the nutrition relative to that as we go through. But it's really important to understand 6.4 is where everything is most available. When we talk about the critical terms, we talk about anions and cations, and of course anions are negatively charged and cations are positively charged. And it's not just that they're negatively and positively charged, it's the number of charges, because that determines how they interrelate. If you've got two positive charges and 3 negative charges, that, in the case of phosphorus with 3 negatives and calcium with 2 positives, then you've got a problem with phosphorus tying up with calcium, because the 3 negatives will bond to the 2 positives and create an insoluble form of phosphate that is not available to your crop. And that's a huge issue with water-soluble phosphate, the fact that over 70% of your phosphorus becomes part of a huge frozen reserve of phosphorus in the soil. So we see there, when we talk about major and minor cations or major and minor anions, the immediate thought is, oh, well, one's more important than the other. And that is something you have to clearly understand is not the case. Major and minor refers to the amount of those minerals that are present for plant nutrition. Trace minerals are spark plugs. They trigger a whole range of enzymic reactions, for example, and they're only required in tiny amounts, but that doesn't make them less important. If you're a zinc deficient, for example, you will have a small leaf size, which is going to have a huge impact upon your zinc productivity, your tea productivity, because zinc is required to produce auxins, and auxins govern leaf size. So a zinc deficient will be a smaller leaf size and smaller yield just for one trace mineral. So the importance of the major minerals and minor minerals is about amounts, not importance. We mentioned phosphate, we mentioned calcium and phosphate often locking up together. It's a huge issue. So when we talk about nutrition farming, we talk about minerals, microorganisms, and humus, and the interplay between those three things. Now, we've identified, we'll talk about it a little later, we've identified some ideal levels, some key ratios that we look at in the soil test that we like to have, you know, a 1-to-1 phosphorus to sulfur ratio, for example, is one example. And we find that if we can achieve that, we do better. And then we find with tissue testing, with plant tissue testing, that obviously there are guidelines relative to tea, and you want to have minimum levels of everything present in that plant. But there's also, if you can have luxury levels, which is the high end of the acceptable range, if you can achieve luxury levels of 4 minerals, we'll talk about them shortly, then we see wonderful outcomes in terms of yield and resilience. And we'll talk about what I call the big 4 a little later. We also, our agronomy teams across the world use monitoring tools. We like some of these plant sap meters, and we also use a new microbial tool that we'll talk about shortly. So that's just how we manage the mineral soil tests, leaf tests, correcting whatever's deficient, often perhaps using foliars as being more cost-effective alternative if that's appropriate. Then the microbial part of the mineral microbe humus trio, when we start recognizing that this story is huge, that this hidden workforce literally determines farming success. Now, I mentioned a simple little tool called the microbiometer, which has become a hugely important part of this regenerative approach, because it's a simple in-field tool that you can measure where you're at in terms of total microbial biomass. And what we find, what I find walking fields in many, many countries, is that without exception, the highest reading of microbial biomass, which can be done very simply and very inexpensively on farm, the highest reading will always be your best paddock, will be your most productive block. And there's no exceptions. I can walk on to in any country and say, okay, show me your best field, show me your worst field. And everyone's got one. They've got one that costs them money and one that makes them money. And then we test with this little test, measuring total microbial biomass, and the bad block will measure 100, the good block will measure 800, and that's every time. The higher the reading, the better you do. So it's a very handy little tool to see where you're at and where you need and why you need to make some adjustments. So part of that microbe management involves basically developing practices that are microbe friendly, buffering salts when we're using them, buffering chemicals or reducing our need for them, introducing new microorganisms with compost, with microbial inoculums, and we'll talk about how simple that can be to produce on farm, feeding soil life with cover crops, creating optimum conditions and stimulating soil life with things like humic and fulvic acid. Foliar fertilizing is not normally thought of relative to soil life, but what we've found is that if you can fast track chlorophyll density, and if you understand that the plant is feeding 30% of all the sugars it makes from photosynthesis, feeding them to the roots, giving them away to the life beneath its roots, then we understand that if we can speed up the production of those sugar factories by greening up the plant more efficiently, 12 times more efficiently is the story with foliars, then we're feeding more sugars, more glucose to the soil life, and we get a subsequent soil life stimulation. We look at how we can eliminate the more damaging chemicals, and we talk about bringing back the earthworms wherever we can. So that's the microbial side, and we'll talk in more detail in a moment. And then we look at the humus, the organic matter side of the story. So humus is the sweet-smelling, chocolate-colored substance that was produced by microorganisms, and it serves as their home base and their support system. It's also the only thing in your soil that can hold on to everything. So in your soil, you've got little particles of clay called clay colloids that hold on to things, the cations like calcium, magnesium, potassium, and so forth. And then you've got the humus colloid, these little particles of organic matter that also can hold on to cations, but they're the only thing in the soil that can hold on to anions. So we're talking about nitrate, nitrogen, we're talking about phosphorus, we're talking about very leachable trace minerals like boron, or major minerals like sulfur that can only be stored. Humus, for example, is the sulfur storehouse. That's the boron storehouse. So hugely important that humus is the home base for microorganisms. But more importantly, when we look at this microorganism story, is the relatively new research from a microbiology perspective that comes from the US, and it's only really 5 or 6 years old, and it involves a phenomenon called rhizophagy. So phagy means to eat, and rhizo means roots, and it really is this discovery that plants, your tea crop, gets over half of its nutrition, not from what you put on from a bag, not from what you foliar sprayed, not from the plant just grabbing minerals from the soil, but half of the nutrition of your tea crop comes from the plants literally eating microorganisms. The roots can consume microorganisms. They pour out this oxidant called a superoxide that strips off the cell walls of those microbes, and then they eat the nutritions held in that microbial body. And then they spit out via their root hairs a small percentage of those prisoners that were held within that were being eaten without their cell walls, and those creatures rebuild their cell walls, and through a process called quorum sensing, they communicate to other organisms who are crowded around that plant root waiting for their daily feed, and they communicate to the organisms the exact requirements of the plant from whom they just escaped. They say, look, this bloke needs this, this, and this. If we look after him or her, he will look after us. And so it's a whole new system that we didn't even know existed, and we start to recognize the bankruptcy of a system where a whole bunch of chemicals increasingly kill the golden goose, because the golden goose is the microbes that are feeding your plant. And so you need to change your perspective and recognize that you are farming microorganisms, and the better you farm them, the more money you'll make, the less problems you'll have, and the more fun you'll have farming, essentially. That's a paradigm shift. That's a change in mindset to understand it's not how it could be, it's how it is. And you just have to wrap your head around that and how you can work with that natural system rather than the current model of working against it. So just continuing the humus story, it's our greatest water management tool. It improves nutritional value. It reduces chemical contamination of our soil. We see the higher the humus levels, the lower the levels of contamination, because humus is like a giant carbon filter. It's the major driver of soil and plant resilience. We find the higher the levels of organic matter, the lower the need for chemical intervention. It cleanses, as we said, it's the only thing that can hold nitrates, and nitrates, of course, are proven carcinogens, and nitrates are leaching into all of our waterways everywhere on the planet, and part of that increased leaching relates to that loss of 2/3 of our humus, the only thing in the soil that can hold on to nitrates and stop that leaching. And of course, as I mentioned, humus is the glue that holds on to that precious topsoil, and it sponsors soil structure. And it gives us a soil that will, a really important word in the brave new world of climate change farming is the word infiltration. You want water to suck into that soil. You don't want it to just wash topsoil off and take it down the river. You want infiltration. And there are tests that you can do very simply on farm that measure your level of infiltration, but they're directly relative to organic matter. The higher your organic matter, the greater your infiltration, the less your loss of topsoil. So when we talk about tips to build humus, and of course, in our country, we recently had a scenario where our largest bank was asking the question, what determines profitability? They've had years of farmers wanting to get bigger or get out and coming to them and saying, look, I need to buy my neighbor's farm. And so then they look and they say, do you qualify for a loan? And they tick all the boxes and say, yes, you qualify. They loan the money, and too many of those loans are falling over. So this national bank, the largest bank in Australia, decided they would do research on 800 farms for 3 years and look at every aspect of productivity and how you grow things, and basically see what made you more profitable. What was it that determined your profitability? Because the current standards are simply not working, because they're making mistakes on who they lend money to. And what they discovered on 800 farms and 3 years of research was the single most important determinant of your profitability was the percentage of organic matter in your soil. It was that important. No one recognized how important this substance was until that research. So it's really important to look at how can you build organic matter on your farms, because it will result in increased profitability. Now, one of the huge phenomenon that we're seeing globally is the concept of cover cropping and cocktail cover crops, and even underplanting, where you thought, well, I'll never plant anything under a tea crop, but there are crops that there are things that you can investigate, and it's certainly our coffee growers have begun looking at planting cocktail cover crops under the coffee plants and so forth. But there's really, really good findings relative to the benefit of putting multiple species into a cover crop, particularly with legumes, because legumes tend to favour the fungi in the soil and encourage an improvement in fungal numbers in the soil, which is really important because they're the creatures most missing. So soil structure changes, humus creation and moves, soil life thrives. It's been found that if you can put 5 families of plants, this is quite important research from a Brazilian scientist, 5 families in that cover crop, so grasses, cereals, brassicas, legumes. Now that's a fairly common cover crop mix, but the missing link looks like it's pronounced chenopods, but it's actually pronounced chenopods. And you only need 1% of chenopods in the blend, but chenopods are everything from the beet family, like sugar beet, silver beet, and so forth, amaranth, quinoa, and spinach. It's a very small group, but you only need 1% of that seed in your blend. And what's been discovered, if you can put the 5 species in there, there's something quite magical almost that happens. And it's been very well researched from the US Department of Agriculture, that when the 5 species, and only when the 5 species are present in your soil, messaging begins between the plant roots, and the plants begin an outpouring of substances called phenolic compounds. Now, that's what people drink tea for, because they're high in antioxidants called phenolic compounds. Well, it turns out that when the plant roots begin pouring phenolic compounds into the soil, that puts soil life into hyperdrive. And so we see all these wonderful changes. We see soil life thrive, we see soil structure change and so forth, based upon that finding that we need to put 5 families of plants within a cover crop. Now, you might think, well, that's not going to, because you have had the water issue, and now, of course, we're moving back into a drought model for the next few years. The experts are now telling us. And if you look at the idea of drought-proofing your farm with cover crops, you think, well, that can't happen. But if you look at the Paul Scherrer Institute from Switzerland, you see that roots hold themselves a 90% water, that the microbes surrounding the roots can hold through this sludge that they produce 30% more moisture, that roots themselves pour out something called mucogel that can hold 10 times its own weight in water. And that's a very simple thing at the bottom here, that if you can grow a cover crop, even on a place that you might be thinking of planting tea that you're trying to improve before you plant, 40 tonnes basically digest down to 10 tonnes, and that will increase organic matter by 1%. This is putting everything back. This is giving so you will receive. And 1% increase in organic matter, those nutrients found in that 40 tonnes of crop residue back before the price rises was $2,000 per hectare in nutrients. So sometimes it can be worth that concept of giving back to receive, and the research shows that you continue to receive benefits for several years after that cover crop. So humic acid and fulvic acid have become big players in building humus. Humic acid particularly important because it's considered to be the most important of all fungal stimulants. It's the strongest, the most potent stimulant of beneficial fungi. And of course, embracing compost is very good research showing that compost is kind of a triggering mechanism for the soils reclaiming their capacity to build humus from the roots as they die off, from the crop residues and so forth, that the compost can trigger that humus building phenomenon. So it becomes very important. And of course, earthworms, we mentioned how they're missing most often. 4 times more rapidly they create humus. So they'll take organic matter and convert it to humus 4 times more quickly than natural decomposition. So they become hugely important in a world where we need to sequester carbon into our soils. They become another one of those massively important organisms. They produce that little worm. If you look here on the photo, we see this little castings that they deposit on top of the soil. That's 10 times more potassium, 7 times more nitrogen, 5 times more phosphorus, 3 times more magnesium. and 1.5 times more calcium than the surrounding soils. You've got yourself a little fertilizer machine, literally. And if you can achieve the holy grail of nutrition farming, which is 25 earthworms per shovelful, they will produce 300 tons of earthworm castings per hectare per year. Now, I don't know what you pay for earthworm castings in your country, but we pay in bulk $200 a ton. Now, you just got 300 times 200, which is $60,000 worth of free fertilizer if you looked after your earthworms in that instance. So it really is a wonderful thing. And of course, the earthworm produces a completely unique group of organisms in its gut that then, of course, are put out into the soil. And you can't get those organisms anywhere. That specific group of nitrogen-fixing and phosphate-solubilizing and disease control organisms you can only get from an earthworm's gut. If you've got no earthworms, you don't have those organisms and you don't have their benefits. So it's really important to try and get earthworms back into your soil. And of course, in our country, there's a whole market now for just the liquid. You pour liquid through your worm beds, and that leachate has become a whole fertilizer because it contains those minerals that are missing, those microbes that are missing. It's really a microbial soup that brings back that inoculum. If you don't have earthworms, you don't have those organisms, so you use a worm soup or a worm juice to reintroduce those very beneficial organisms. And increasingly, we have our farmers making extracts from vermicast, making on-farm, just using usually a simple combination of cow manure and straw, and building their worm beds, harvesting their vermicast compost. Basically, an extract is much more effective than a compost tea or a leachate. An extract, you put it inside a sort of a tea bag, and you, with a high pressure hose, or you stir it really violently for quite some period, but you're basically driving the microbes off the humus. So you're forcing them off almost. And the numbers, when you do the counts, are vastly higher, sometimes 10 times higher than a leachate. So the whole model now is to make your own vermicast on farm and to make these extracts from it. And there's some tremendous results amongst some of our farmers utilizing vermicast extracts. So I mentioned that little tool, and there it is up there. That's called the microbiometer. Now, not only does this microbiometer measure total microbial biomass, but it also measures the fungi to bacteria ratio. And we've discovered that that ratio is one of the most important single ratios in the soil. Now, I was at a large conference, a 5-day conference recently. We had 250 farmers. We had 5 farmers from 5 countries who were talking about their experience, their journey in regenerative agriculture. And what we found was that every one of those 5 said that the turnaround point on their profitability came when they improved their fungi to bacteria ratio. It is so important. If you test, you'll see where you're at on your tea soils, and you'll see what you need to improve. But what most commonly you see, basically from the fungicides, is that you've killed off the fungal component and you need to bring them back. And it's tremendously beneficial, particularly in terms of resistance from disease, when you bring back some of these fungi. But this little tool enables you take a soil sample, you use a phone app that shines a light on an extract from that sample and measures. You put a chemical in there that encapsulates the microorganisms. The light from your phone app, and your camera is activated with a light coming out of the camera. It reflects off the encapsulated microorganisms, and there's a whole system in the app that will analyze what's present, and it correlates quite strongly with normal, much more expensive microbial assays of your soil. So it gives you a very good guideline of what you've got in your soil. And what we find is the higher your microbial mass, the better you'll do. As I mentioned, I can walk into any field anywhere in the world and say, okay, show me your best field, show me your worst field. And the farmer's watching as you do the test. And he's never thought about microbes having anything to do with his profitability, but he knows he's got a good block and he's got a bad block, and he's looking at them. And then the results come up on the screen of your mobile phone from when you finish this test. It takes 20 minutes in total. But when you finish the test, the results come up, and the look on the farmer's face, this look of, oh my goodness, because the best block, as I said, will be usually 7 times higher than the worst block. And he suddenly realizes that his profitability is the microbes in the soil, and he's never thought that before in his life. So that's a paradigm shifting moment for that farmer to realize that, and we don't see any exceptions. The higher the productivity, the higher the microbial biomass in that soil. So it's that important. And so if you can understand that and begin building your biomass, you can't help but do better. So one of the issues that we find is that we're lacking fungi in the soil. And so one of the ways to bring it back is to have some legumes, perhaps interplanted where you can under the crops. Legumes are a very good tool. But there's a couple of little tricks. If you look at the photo here, you see that red pigment. Very commonly, there's no red pigment when you check a legume. And what that means is that you don't have molybdenum. It can also be less seriously linked to boron and sulfur, but most importantly, it's molybdenum, because 80% of the soils that we test, particularly in India, we just don't see any in those soils, are lacking molybdenum. We're only talking 30 to 50 grams of sodium molybdate per hectare in a foliar spray, but without it, you're not fixing nitrogen. And if you're not fixing nitrogen, you're not releasing acid exudates that solubilize phosphorus and calcium, which are pretty important minerals, and you're not stimulating fungi, because it's the acid exudates that come from fixing nitrogen that stimulate that missing microbe called beneficial fungi. So if it's not red inside, none of that's happening. So it's important that you understand that for a start, you've got to have nodules. And if you don't even have nodules on your legumes, on the roots of the legumes, that's a lack of sulfur. It can be a couple of other minerals, but most commonly it's sulfur. And if the nodules don't have the red color inside, then nothing's happening, and you've got a plant that essentially is a waste of space in your field. So soil and leaf tests, often they don't correlate. You would think, well, if it says I've got this shortage in the soil, then I'm going to see that in the leaf, but that's not what you see. And that relates to the fact that minerals impact each other. Too little, too much will stimulate or antagonize the uptake of another mineral. So the leaf test is arguably almost more important, the tissue test, than the soil test, because the tissue test is just asking the plant, what do you want, plant? Oh, that's what you want. Okay, here it is. And usually, and I'm not sure about the mechanics of your situation of how much foliar fertilizing is done in tea crops on slopes and so forth, but usually the way that you address that shortage is through a foliar fertilizer, which is 12 times more efficient than putting it through the soil. And then you can basically, if you've got high phosphorus that's tying up zinc, there's no point in putting zinc in the soil because the high phosphorus continues to tie it up. You foliar spray the zinc and go straight to the source to correct the problem, and it can be very, very advantageous. So if we look at that soil and leaf test, we see they should be the same, and that's just an example of the fact they're not. And in that particular test, the big difference is magnesium. The soil test says we've got plenty of magnesium. The leaf test says we don't. And if you didn't do that leaf test, you would never know that you were lacking magnesium. And a lack of magnesium will cost you, not sometimes, but always, because magnesium is the most important single mineral in the green pigment called chlorophyll. That pigment, that green thing that houses the sugar factories that determine your productivity, that green pigment is basically the centerpiece is magnesium with 4 nitrogens tagged onto the magnesium. There's no point in putting on heaps of urea if you don't have the magnesium to tag it to. So magnesium, if you hadn't done this leaf test in this example, you wouldn't even know you were lacking in this mineral that can have such an impact on your production and profitability. So leaf tests are really, really important. So soil and leaf testing is about reclaiming responsibility for your own enterprise. You don't take advice from people with vested interests, and that includes me, because my company sells things. You need to understand how your soil and leaf works and what your guidelines are and what you're shooting for, and so that you can understand and become master of your own enterprise. It's really important. It's a key part. Knowledge becomes your empowerment in this regenerative approach. So some of the things that you don't always have to tag on to your soil test, but it's really good at least once to include them. We want to measure chloride because a lot of tests don't. It's required for vegetative growth, and you are growing a vegetative crop, obviously. So if you often you'll have too much chloride through the use of potassium chloride. But if you're more than 100 kilometers from the ocean and you're not picking up sodium chloride through evaporation and dropping it on the land up to 100 kilometers away from the ocean, chloride can be deficient, and that can make a big difference to vegetative growth. So you want to make sure you haven't got too much or too little, and measure chloride. Silicon is huge. It's never been recognized as an essential mineral, and that's soon to change. We now understand that if we're going to be proactive in pest and disease management, we need to consider the starting point being cell strength. We'll talk about that a little later. And if we can strengthen that cell wall, then the disease organisms that drill through that cell wall, you've got a physical barrier that you've created to buckle their hyphae. They need to get through the cell wall to get to the yolk of the egg, to get to the cytoplasm, the center of the cell, which is their food source. So they have to get through a cell wall to get to their food, just like a sap-sucking insect has to chomp through a substantial cell wall to get to the yolk in the center of that cell. So if you can strengthen the cell wall, it's a great starting point to create more resilience. So the question is, what is the cell wall made of? Well, it's made of silica and it's made of calcium, equally important. And so we have a focus upon boosting that's usually with foliars, boosting silica and calcium to strengthen that cell wall. Now, molybdenum, I mentioned 80% of the soils we test are deficient in molybdenum, and you can't access free nitrogen without molybdenum. There's an enzyme called nitrogenase that allows nitrogen-fixing organisms to pull nitrogen from the atmosphere. It's made from molybdenum. If you don't have molybdenum, you're going to have to pay more and more for increasing the expense of urea when you could have got some of that for free. And then there's a second role of molybdenum, and that's converting nitrates to protein. And you've got to understand that protein drives plant immunity. Our immune system is driven by protein. If you can't convert protein, you're not going to have much of an immune system. And basically, molybdenum is required, is hugely important in something called the nitrate reductase enzyme that converts nitrates through to protein. So if it's lacking, you're going to have problems. And most of the Indian soils we look at, you don't have molybdenum. It's been a game changer for some of our coffee growers in terms of pest and disease pressure when they could build protein suddenly by addressing that molybdenum shortage. So you do need to test it and find out where you're at. Now, cobalt increasingly has been recognized as sort of mother's milk for nitrogen fixers, but it plays other roles, and it plays roles in productivity. So you need to know that you've got your 2 parts per million of cobalt in your soil. And selenium's been considered more to do with animal health, but recently there's been research suggesting that plants also require selenium to make them more resilient. So we measure those in the soil, and we talk about key ratios. I won't spend too much time on it, but this is an example of one of our soil tests, and you can see the sort of things that we're measuring on that soil test. But we look at this very important ratio called the calcium to magnesium ratio. It's the most important. There are 6 ratios that our agronomy teams will check out on a soil test, but the most important of those is called the calcium to magnesium ratio. And why it's so important is because the most important element for plant growth isn't N, it's not P, it's not N, it's not K, it's not calcium, which is an important mineral. The most important single element, not mineral, is oxygen. You know how important it is for you. You close your nose, you're dead in 2 minutes unless you're a pearl diver. So oxygen is required by the plant roots for everything. It's required by the organisms around that roots, all desperately in need of that very important substance called oxygen. So the situation that was described at the start of the seminar, following 4 years of rain, that you've got these tight, closed soils, that's a huge issue for your resilience and productivity, because what you've lost is gas exchange. So what's gas exchange? So this is a process through which oxygen diffuses. So diffusion is just a natural process where gases can't help themselves but to move from high concentration to low concentration. So oxygen diffuses from the atmosphere into the soil if that soil is open and friable, and then the roots use it for everything, the organisms use it for everything, and then they breathe out. And they breathe out carbon dioxide. And of course, that carbon dioxide is now in a higher concentration in the root zone, so it diffuses out, and the plant leaves waiting with tiny little mouths called stomates to capture that CO2, combine it with water and sunlight in an almost miraculous process called photosynthesis. And that's how you grow things. Without CO2, without oxygen, you don't do well. And when you've got a tight, closed soil that you're describing, that is a hugely serious issue that you need to address. And the starting point from a physical, there are microbes that can help, but the starting point from a mineral perspective is the calcium to magnesium ratio. Why is that? Because calcium, and you guys neglect calcium. I see it on your soil tests. You don't do your liming like you should. But basically, calcium is it's called ionic radius. Minerals are different sizes. Calcium is think of it as a beach ball, a large ion, and it has a double positive charge. It's called a divalent cation, just means it's got two positive charges. So think of the beach ball with a positive charge on each side of that beach ball, grabbing hold of a little clay colloid on one side, a little ball of clay, and holding it with that positive and negative charge, holding it like a nail to a magnet. And on the other side of that beach ball, grabbing another particle of clay and holding on to it and pushing apart the clay. That's called flocculation. That's how your soil breathes. The better flocculated your soil, the better the oxygen comes in, the better the CO2 comes out for photosynthesis, the better your gas exchange, the exchange of oxygen for CO2. So the calcium component is huge. And then magnesium's like a golf ball compared to that beach ball. And it's also got two charges. So it grabs clay on one side and grabs clay on the other side and pulls the soil in. So it's tighter and more closed. That's the effect of a high magnesium soil. It's a tight, closed soil that you're walking around on platform shoes because the mud sticks to your boots. That's a high magnesium soil. And so you can say, oh, well, I won't worry about magnesium. I'll just do my liming. But you can't forget magnesium because you've got two core roles when you grow things. You're managing gas exchange. The better you do it, the better you'll do. And you're managing chlorophyll, the green pigment that determines the sugar factories that produce stuff. That's how you grow things. So you're a chlorophyll manager, and you can't ignore magnesium because magnesium is the centerpiece of chlorophyll. So what you do, there's a specific calcium to magnesium ratio that's relevant to your soil based on the CEC of the soil, the percentage of sand and clay of that soil. So a light sandy soil might be a 3-to-1 ratio of calcium to magnesium, and a heavy clay soil might be a 7-to-1, or you might be somewhere in between. And there's an ideal ratio that our soil test will show you, and other soil tests can do as well, where your ratio might be 5.2-to-1 or 4.6-to-1, but you aim to achieve the ratio relevant to your soil to improve gas exchange. And that's the major role of the calcium to magnesium ratio. And that, of course, also improves infiltration so that you don't wash the topsoil off, you infiltrate that water into the soil where it can be stored and so forth. So we won't spend too much time because I don't think we've got too much time to continue with all the other ratios, but just quickly, phosphorus to sulfur, 1-to-1. So on that soil test, we've got 23, we've got a shortage of phosphorus, and we look at sulfur and we've got plenty of sulfur, we've got 43. So in this situation, we would try and build our phosphorus levels to be 1-to-1. So we'd aim for 40 or 50 parts per million of phosphorus and 40 or 50 parts per million of sulfur. And we find because sulfur shuts down phosphorus, phosphorus shuts down sulfur, when you get them at 1-to-1, you get very good utilization of both of those minerals. Now, the magnesium to potassium ratio, that's looked at in terms of parts per million. We like to see, again, a 1-to-1 ratio. We want to see maybe on this soil 400 parts per million of each. And what we've got here is this very, very serious oversupply of magnesium. It should be 400 and it's got 1,200. And we've got this deficiency of potassium, serious deficiency of potassium in this particular crop. So that's the kind of key things. We look at the ratios between those 6 ratios, and just as a great thing when you understand why you're looking at those ratios, because you can look at your soil test in a whole new light, and each soil test becomes an exciting adventure to see how you're going in terms of achieving the ratios that work. So talking about the most important minerals, you obviously think it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and they certainly are important minerals, but calcium is massively important. We call calcium the trucker of all minerals. And if you look at Mulder's chart, you'll understand why we use that term, because you can see that calcium, if you don't have enough of it, is responsible for stimulating 7 minerals. The uptake of 7 minerals is determined by this very important mineral called calcium. So manganese uptake, potash uptake, iron uptake, phosphate, boron, zinc uptake, and magnesium uptake are governed by having enough calcium in the soil to ensure that. Now, if you put too much calcium, then that same mineral antagonizes those same 7 minerals. So now you've got less uptake of 7 things because you put too much of a good thing. So it very much is a case of getting it right with calcium, and a good soil test will tell you exactly how much calcium in terms of kilos that you need per hectare to correct and put the right amount of calcium back into that soil. So nitrogen, really important, but the most abundant mineral in the plant, but the most abused and misused of all of them. So the problem with too much nitrogen, which we see all of the time, and so we teach you how to monitor. We don't want too little nitrogen, we don't want too much, and we see too much happening so often in so many crops. And that's why we've got this huge outpouring of nitrous oxide from agriculture, because we're misusing it. So we don't want to underdo it because it makes a big difference to yield. We just need to use it more efficiently. But when you do oversupply nitrogen, the first mineral you shut down is even more expensive than nitrogen. The first thing you shut down is potassium uptake. So nitrogen antagonizes potassium uptake. Too much, now you need more potassium, which costs even more than nitrogen. Second mineral that's shut down by too much nitrogen is calcium. So now you've got no cell strength. So you've got much more disease pressure, much more fungal pressure, much more insect pressure, because you've got no cell strength to keep out, to form a physical barrier to protect you from insects and disease. And you'll see less boron availability. Now, there's a wonderful book called Plant Nutrition and Disease, edited by Professor Don Huber, and he will describe nitrogen, getting it right, not too much, too little, the right form of nitrogen is the biggest single player in pest and disease management. Second is potassium, third is calcium, and fifth is boron. So your one thing where you put too much nitrogen, that creates disease in its own right, but now you shut down potassium, calcium, and boron, all of which are intimately related to your disease and insect pressure. And you created that by not understanding nitrogen management. Now, when we talk about nitrogen relative to this whole issue of climate change and the loss of carbon into our atmosphere, when we talk about that, and just so you understand that, what we've lost, what the soils have contributed, understand one thing, there's only the same number of carbon molecules that have ever been here. You can't make new carbon cycles. It's called the carbon cycle. The largest storehouse is the soil, where it's stored in both organic, like organic carbon, and inorganic forms like calcium carbonate. That's by far the largest storehouse. Then there's carbon-based life forms, people, animals, plants, and so forth. And then it can become the gaseous form, and it cycles between those three places. But 2/3 of what used to be in the soil is now in the atmosphere. And what does that equate to? That's 476 gigatons since 1860 that we put up that used to be in the soil that's now in the atmosphere. During that same time, with everything else we've done with coal-fired power stations and motor vehicles and 7.4 billion lungs breathing CO2 and so forth, that's 250 gigatons. So twice the amount came from the soil, and the obvious way to fix it is put it back where it came from. And if we look at how did we lose so much from our soil, a big player is misuse of nitrogen. For every kilogram of nitrogen that you apply over and above the requirements of the plant at that time, you burn out 100 kilograms of carbon, which thickens the blanket, traps the heat, and changes our world. So nitrogen mismanagement's not just about nitrous oxide, it's the biggest player, or up there amongst the two biggest players in the CO2 accumulation in that greenhouse blanket. Phosphorus, we're just working our way through some of the phosphorus issues. Now, I understand you've got soils in southern India that quite quickly will fix phosphorus, will lock up phosphorus. What we suggest to our growers is that they do a second measurement on their soil test where they measure total phosphorus in the soil. And what they find is sometimes they've got like 25 tons of DAP equivalent locked up in their soil, because only 27% is what you get from DAP and MAP. It's a bit better with rock phosphate. If you can use rock phosphate, it's a lot better. But DAP and MAP are really, really rapidly lock up. And so then it becomes a tool of how can you stabilize DAP and MAP if you're using those inputs, and how can you access your frozen reserve? That's really important, because if you've done a total phosphorus test, you'll know that you've got really large amounts of phosphorus there in an unavailable form. And then it becomes, how can I release that? And we'll talk about some of those things. But one of the tricks for stabilizing DAP and MAP, if you are using them, is combining them with soluble humic acid granules, which at 5%, so it's not expensive, that that basically dissolve at the same rate as those DAP and MAP and create what's called a phosphate humate that can't lock up. That's a huge benefit from combining humates with soluble fertilizers like water-soluble phosphorus. So the kind of strategies to free up some of your frozen phosphorus: legumes, because they release an acid exudate that will break the bond between calcium and phosphorus; compost, fulvic acid, that other humate. There's humic acid and there's fulvic acid, but fulvic acid is the one that's been tremendously researched to release locked up phosphorus. Mycorrhizal fungi, of course, burrow out and reach out and give you 10 times the surface area to access very immobile minerals like phosphorus and even trace minerals like zinc. And digesting your crop residues, bringing an inoculum in to digest those residues and convert them. And the organisms that do that also make phosphate available in many instances. So that's a good strategy. Magnesium, centerpiece of chlorophyll. High magnesium soils give you a tight soil, and that's where you would use something like gypsum to try and open up that soil. But very commonly, the mistake people make if they've got a magnesium deficient soil is to apply magnesium sulfate. That's nonsense. That you never put magnesium sulfate in the soil. You can foliar spray magnesium sulfate, but why would you put it in the soil? That's how you get rid of magnesium. You put gypsum in, it's called calcium sulfate. It breaks apart, it ionizes apart, it forms magnesium sulfate, the most leachable form of magnesium. You leach it out of your soil and that changes soil structure positively because you've got rid of the tightening effect of magnesium. Well, why would you put the most leachable form of magnesium into your soils? You never use magnesium sulfate in the soil. You can use things like magnesium oxide, magnesium carbonate, and so forth. Micronized magnesiums you can put into the soil if you want liquid forms. You can do that in a liquid form, but magnesium sulfate is not the way to do it if you want it to stay there. So you can foliar spray it, but not put it in the soil. Now, potassium's huge, and I understand you've got issues with holding on to potassium in your particular soil types. It's really, really important because I call it the money mineral. Basically, it does a whole range of things, but most importantly, it sizes up leaf size, it sizes up grains, it sizes up fruit and so forth. But it's a vegetative mineral, so it's really important for a vegetative crop like tea, for example. It opens stomates, so it improves photosynthesis. I know you guys all use potassium chloride, but potassium sulfate is what we prefer. If you could access it, it's much, much better than potassium chloride. And potassium sulfate works really well as a foliar spray, which makes it very cost effective to address potassium. Potassium chloride doesn't work very well at all as a foliar spray. It's not even worth using. But potassium sulfate, particularly when you add fulvic acid to it, has a really, really good impact. That's measurable, of course, if you're using a potassium meter. But how we monitor how my agronomy team monitors potassium in the soil, any farmer can do it. You measure potassium is the most mobile mineral, which means as soon as you're deficient, it will rush from the lower leaves to service cell division in the growing tips. So it'll move to those growing tips. And that's where you're doing tissue testing. You're measuring the first fully developed leaf up at the growing end. But you're not, by the time, if you've got a potassium deficiency and you're draining from the lower leaves, by the time the entire tea plant is drained and you finally pick it up on the new leaves, you've been without potassium for several weeks, and that will cost you in yield, not sometimes, but always. So having a tool to monitor the top leaves, the first fully developed leaf, and then the bottom leaf, they need to be the same. So you squeeze a little bit of tea leaf with the garlic crusher, squeeze a few drops of juice, put it into this meter called a potassium. You only need 3 drops, and you measure the top leaf, and then you clean it out gently. Then you measure the bottom leaf with a few drops, and they need to be the same. As soon as there's 10% lower in the bottom leaf, you've got a potassium deficiency, and now you've got fingertip control of the what I call the money mineral. It's a really, really important strategy. We have growers across the planet who say, "Oh my goodness, this has been the game changer for me." Just being able to manage more effectively, precision manage that very, very important mineral has made all the difference to my profitability. So keep that in mind. So just talking about the trace minerals, zinc, we need to see 5 to 10 parts per million, and very often that's not present. It's very easy to make your own chelated zinc. You just put zinc sulfate with fulvic acid at 1 kilo per hectare, so it's not expensive. And you foliar spray it. Again, it's whether or not you can foliar spray there. Copper fungicides are really hard. They're on zinc. They induce zinc deficiencies. It's one of the reasons zinc deficiency is so common. Copper fungicides are actually not the best option to control fungal diseases. Copper is a heavy metal. It's not just fungicidal. Copper is biocidal. Copper affects all soil life, and copper doesn't go away. So if you build copper to high levels in your soil through overuse of copper fungicides, you've compromised your soil life for a long time to come. So it's really important not to overdo copper fungicides for that reason. Now, molybdenum, as I said, 80% of the soils we look at are deficient in molybdenum. And look at this little study from my home country of New Zealand. You can't quite see it all on this chart from where I am, but you can see here, this is just the control where they use superphosphate with no molybdenum. And this is just 1 cup. This was not foliar spray. This was put into the soil with the superphosphate. 1 cup of sodium molybdate, and the yield increases went from, the smallest was 43%, but 30, look at that, 600% yield increase, 355%, 89%, really large increase. And that's because you opened the door to the free gift. That's the only explanation for huge yield increases. These broadacre crops were nitrogen deficient. You opened the door to the free gift, the 74,000 tonnes of nitrogen gas that hovers above every hectare. The molybdenum gave you access via the nitrogenase enzyme to be able to fix some of that nitrogen. And on these obviously nitrogen deficient broadacre crops, that made a huge difference to yield. So really important to look at molybdenum. We mentioned also the concept of the big four. And here's an example of a tissue test and what we're talking about here. So we're talking about 4 minerals that we want to see at luxury levels on every time we do a leaf test. So the minerals are phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and the surprise package, the 4th one's not potassium and it's not nitrogen. The 4th one is boron. So phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and boron. So if we look at what a luxury level is on a leaf test, see there it's 0.2 to 0.5 for this particular crop. For phosphorus, well, 0.5 is what we want. What this guy's got is less, he's right down in the deficient zone, but where this bar should be is up here on the luxury zone at 0.5. Calcium should be 0.2 to 0.6. We want it at 0.6. So we want calcium up here on the luxury line. We want magnesium at 0.4. He's only got 0.14, but we want magnesium up here. And you can't see boron on my chart here because it's got photos in front of it. But boron we want to see at the luxury level of boron. If it's 50 parts per million, we want to see 50 parts per million of boron. So and what we see, this is really interesting, we work in so many countries globally, 55 countries, and what we see with agronomy teams in those countries, and what we see is that 1 in 3, well, not 30%, so 3 of 10 of the leaf tests we look at, not only are these minerals nowhere near where they need to be, they're actually all deficient. So the 4 minerals that are most important for productivity are actually all deficient, and you're not having fun farming. So what is the role of those 4 minerals? They're all intimately linked to photosynthesis, the most important process on the planet. It's how you grow stuff. It's where the glucose building block for all carbon-based life forms comes from, including you. That's where you came from. That's where the building block comes from. So nothing more important than photosynthesis. And these 4 minerals are the most. We look at calcium. It governs the uptake of the 7 things that determine whether you've got blotches or pale colors or stripes. We look at magnesium, the centerpiece of chlorophyll. We look at phosphorus, all of the enzymes involved in photosynthesis, beginning with something called ATP or adenosine triphosphate, but all the other enzymes have got a phosphate link. So phosphate is huge. You can't make sugar without it. And you think, why boron? Because calcium doesn't work without boron. Calcium's so important, but calcium doesn't work without boron. The saying, calcium is the trucker of all minerals and boron is the steering wheel. Calcium doesn't do the things we want it to do in the absence of boron, even just down to cell protection. When we talk about calcium being so important in cell strength in that cell wall, well, part of that strength is based on something called calcium pectate, and calcium pectate can't be made without boron. Calcium pectate is calcium and boron are the drivers of that protective armor-like substance that protects from both insects and disease. So you've got to take care of your boron. In fact, ideally, you want to take care of all 4 of those minerals we call the big 4. So in-field monitoring is really important. We like to use a refractometer, which measures dissolved solids, which really shows you how well you're managing chlorophyll. We use nitrate potassium meters. We like to use something called a SAP pH meter. We found that a healthy plant will have a SAP pH of 6.4, and the lower the SAP pH, the more likelihood the pressure you're going to have from fungal disease. It's quite a good finding from an American scientist. So there's Japanese meters called Hariba, SAP pH meters, Hariba nitrate meters, Hariba. You can even get Hariba calcium meters now, Hariba potassium meters, just very handy infield tools to see where you're at and to keep a fingertip control of some of that key nutrition. Like I mentioned, the simple little tool that costs less than $50, a refractometer, squeeze a little bit of juice on that sloping face, the light refracts through the dissolved solids in the plant sap. It basically gives you a guideline. The higher what's called Brix, degrees of Brix, the higher the Brix levels, when you look through that up to the sunlight and the light refracts through the dissolved solids in the sap, the higher the yield potential, the higher the quality, the less likely there'll be insect pressure. And then there's a second reading that when you look through, this is what you see, the 0 to 32 axis, that you never want to see this, the sharp distinction between the 2 hemispheres. That's a calcium deficiency. It'll also be a low Brix level because you don't have calcium trucking 7 minerals into the plant. So you've got a deficiency in dissolved solids, and minerals and amino acids are being measured here. And this is what we want to see. And of course, it will be a higher Brix level. That one's about 12. We want to see this blurry, fuzzy line. That means we've got plenty of calcium. And I'm betting right here and now that I could go to any tea plant that you're growing and it will look like this. And just test it for yourself and confirm it for me if someone wants to do it, because I can put my last dollar on it if I was a gambling man, that will be the case, because you're underdoing calcium. You're not foliar spraying calcium. You're not doing the things you should be doing with calcium, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So I mentioned about SAP pH. Low SAP pH means a higher likelihood of fungal disease. High SAP pH above 6.4 signals a higher potential for insect pressure. Low SAP pH is based upon a lack of calcium, magnesium, potassium, or ammonium nitrogen. And most commonly, it's going to be, and sodium, but most commonly it's going to be calcium, magnesium, or potassium. And you just got to figure which one is the culprit in terms of dropping your SAP pH and increasing your fungal disease pressure. But what's interesting about Dr. Bruce Tanio's finding about 6.4 being the healthy plant, I have never seen a plant at 6.4 anywhere on the planet. I'm talking about lots of countries, 30 countries a year I was visiting before COVID. I've never seen a plant at 6.4 with a fungal disease. Now, that's got to be important. That's one hell of a protective mechanism if you can achieve that magical 6.4 figure. So that's just a nitrogen meter. It's really the mineral that we want to get it just right, and you can find out where it'll be higher during vegetative versus fruiting, but you're trying to maintain vegetative most of the time with the tea bush. But there'll be a sweet spot where the other meters will dovetail, where 2,000 parts per million of nitrogen, of nitrate nitrogen, for example, will correlate with the highest Brix reading, with the best SAP pH, the best potassium level, and so forth. And you'll say, okay, that's my sweet spot. I don't want to go above that. 2,000 parts per million is what I shoot for during the season when I'm harvesting tea several times a season. So. And that's really important when you talk about tea, and the fact that you are stripping it off is that the structural minerals, and calcium's a huge one because calcium's in every cell wall. If you're not addressing calcium shortages with calcium foliar sprays and you're taking calcium, all you're doing is weakening the plant constantly because you're removing calcium that determines cell strength. It's just common sense that needs to be addressed, I think. We mentioned the plant sap potassium meter, and that we measure top leaf, bottom leaf to maintain the proper amount, the correct amount of that mineral. When we do foliar spray, we like to put a microbial inoculum, and that might be a vermicast extract. It might be any other kind of commercial microbial inoculum. It might be something you brewed on farm, but we want to put that with our nutrition. That's called putting the microbes behind the minerals. That enhances foliar response we've shown it does it quite dramatically. that sudden influx of CO2 from as many as 5 billion organisms in a teaspoon of an inoculum, that stimulates tomatal opening and gets a better uptake via this tomato when you combine microbes with minerals. So it's a little strategy that we use. We call it MEND, which means microbially enhanced nutrient delivery. And of course, MEND is the appropriate acronym for something that needs mending, which is many of our agricultural soils. Understanding that minerals vary in their mobility, and so the least mobile of all minerals by far is calcium. Calcium is really poorly uptaken. It's really poorly moved around the plant. And of course, you're pulling it off every time you strip the tea leaves off. And so we find that foliar spraying calcium is beneficial in every crop that we deal with. And we work with 79 different crops, 89 different crops around the world. So there's no exceptions. Foliar calcium is of tremendous value. You can collate things yourself, which can bring the cost down with a simple substance called fulvic acid. You can add fulvic acid to calcium nitrate and create a calcium fulvate. You can add 300 grams per hectare of calcium nitrate to zinc sulfate or manganese sulfate or magnesium sulfate or copper sulfate, and you've created a copper fulvate, a manganese fulvate. You've collated it and magnified it with this wonderful substance called fulvic acid. The reason that people use seaweed in agriculture, and it's very, very popular, it's an integral, essential tool in regenerative agriculture. It contains a quite high percentage of a natural chelating agent, which will chelate other things that you add to kelp. So you put zinc with kelp and you create a zinc mannate, which means you chelated the zinc and made it more available. It contains the 70 minerals or 74 minerals derived from the ocean. It's the highest known. So there are 4 hormones that govern every stage of plant growth, right from seed germination right through to the end of the crop cycle. And those 4 hormones are called cytokinins, gibberellins, auxins, and betaines. And they're produced by the plant from minerals in the soil. Well, we removed a lot of those minerals with extractive agriculture for a lot of decades. And so many plants can't achieve their genetic potential because they don't have the building blocks to build those 4 hormones. But kelp, which waves around and grows in the perfect balance of all 74 minerals in the ocean, it produces 40 times more because it has the building blocks. It produces 40 times more of those 4 hormones than the next closest land-based plant, which happens to be aloe vera. So it's a wonderful source of these essential hormones that can give such a profound effect when you foliar feed, particularly kelp, onto any crop, including tea. And the second thing, another benefit of kelp is that it's a very high source of vitamins, which are made from minerals. And of course, it floats in the perfect blend of 74 minerals in the ocean, so it has very high vitamin levels. And it's a source of complex carbohydrate that the fungi that are missing in so many soils really love. So kelp has a real role to play. So now we're going to talk about blister blight. We're going to talk about some of the concepts that we talked about, how we can apply them specifically to your issues in tea in southern India. And of course, blister blight all over the world is a major, major issue for tea. So we're going to start by talking, as we've talked, about looking at it from a more holistic perspective, looking at minerals, microbes, and humus relative to this disease. And the starting point is calcium. Calcium governs the uptake of 7 other minerals. We've talked about it. It's the most immobile of minerals. It's definitely lacking in your scenario. We've talked about how important it is to open that soil and to allow that soil to breathe and to fire up all the soil biology, which can be protective from this disease. But more important instantly is the role for cell strength to protect, to stop that fungal disease from drilling through that cell wall by creating luxury levels of calcium in that cell wall. So the idea with calcium management, lime according to your requirements, and basically you can use our soil therapy. RJ, who I think is listening in, can help you with the soil therapy reports. Improve your fungi to bacteria ratio. You can measure that with that simple little tool in the field. And that fungi are directly linked to calcium uptake. So using humic acid and kelp to stimulate fungi specifically, if you need to, and you'll find you probably do, then you'll see this improvement in calcium uptake measured on a leaf test. Cover crops and compost can help to improve fungal numbers in the soil. And foliar spraying, understanding that it's really immobile mineral, and foliar spraying, that can be as simple as 3 kilograms of calcium nitrate per hectare with 300 or 400 grams of soluble fulvic acid powder, and perhaps you add some boron in there because boron makes calcium work better. So you might use 1 kilogram of sodium borate in with that foliar spray of calcium nitrate and fulvic acid. It's a good strategy. So back to that idea of building and boosting cell wall strength, it's absolutely a critical part of proactive pest management. Both insects and disease organisms have to break through that barrier to get to that food called the cytoplasm, the yolk in the center of the cell. That's their food source. That's what they're shooting for. And if you can create this protective barrier, it can be of tremendous value. We talked about boron being involved in that protective armor-like substance called calcium pectate, that calcium alone can't do it. We talked about calcium, silica, and boron really being the 3 key players. So how do you put silica on? Well, again, foliar spraying, we like to use, say, 3 litres and 450 litres of water per hectare of potassium silicate. It's the plant-available water-soluble form of silica. And we find that if you can add some kelp, some fulvic acid, and a little bit of a wonderful plant growth promotant called triacontinol, which is compatible. Not many things are compatible with potassium silicate because it's very alkaline. So you can't put calcium with it. Otherwise, it would be a good combination. You can't put phosphorus, you can't put sulfates with potassium silicate. So that's when you're going to use the plant growth promotants like kelp, seaweed, fulvic acid, and this wonderful thing called triacontinol because they're compatible with potassium silicate. What we've known now about silica is not just about cell wall strength, but there's been 9 published papers at the last International Silica Conference that have shown us that it's a really, really important player in what's called immune elicitation. This is a whole new endeavor of scientific research, recognizing that there are certain things that can trigger an immune response in plants. And we've now found that silica may well be the most important immune elicitor, but it's right up there amongst the most important. And what's exciting for tea producers is that there is no exceptions. This is for any producer. Anything that boosts immunity, any immune elicitor, and there are microbes that can do it as well, but any immune elicitor also builds yield. No exceptions. If you boost immunity, you boost yield. And that's a good outcome if you're having problems with yield falling away due to some of these pressures that we've been talking about. So managing nitrogen, we talked about it, and particularly we're talking about potassium. Nitrogen, too much of it shuts down potassium. It's a vegetative mineral. This is a vegetative crop. The most mobile of all minerals, leaves the lower leaves to satisfy the demands of the growing tip. The sap pH drops in those lower leaves. Then it becomes a calling card for blister blight. That's what we see. That's where the disease starts, very commonly on those lower leaves. So potassium meter, invaluable. We said how you do it. You squeeze some juice from the top leaf, squeeze some from the bottom leaf. They've got to be the same. As soon as it's 10% lower in the bottom leaves, you've got a shortage. And that's where foliar potassium, you can fertigate it, but foliar potassium is so much more efficient. Very good study out of Turkey just last year where they compared various forms of potassium application, and foliar potassium absolutely outperformed soil applied potassium. It's a really good way to get potassium into the crop, but don't try and do it with potassium chloride because potassium chloride is really poorly uptaken through the leaf. Trace minerals, really important. So don't forget your trace minerals. Key players in tea quality and disease resistance, and yet so often ignored. So follow, if you're using our lab, you'll get the guidelines of where you need to be at with your tissue tests for the tea, sometimes at different stages of the cycle. But manganese, for example, really important for plant immunity, really important for photosynthesis. The whole starting point of photosynthesis is called photolysis, and that's manganese dependent. So if you're manganese deficient, you're going to suffer. Zinc governs leaf size. That's pretty important. It's going to make a huge difference to yield. Copper, that's the main mineral. Now, people, you think of copper fungicides, that's putting copper on the plant, but copper is used within the plant as the most important single mineral for protection and defense against fungal pathogens within the plant, not on it, but in it. And so it's really, really effective to use chelated copper in the plant and create that internal resistance rather than drenching the plant with copper oxychloride or copper hydroxide, drenching the soil and killing all your beneficial fungi. So it's much more important to use small amounts into the plant. Molybdenum, really important for protein formation, lacking in almost every Indian soil that we look at. So we need to check it. With the big four, we've talked about how that works and why it works, so we won't spend any time, but we're going to do that for this disease because we find tremendous disease resistance if we can lift those 4 minerals: phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and boron. Lift them into that luxury zone and watch what happens with disease and insect resistance and yield, for that matter, because it's probably one of the greatest yield building tools that we've ever worked with our agronomy teams around the world. So anything that increases immunity is worth, so immunoelicitation is worth exploring. We mentioned silica. We've actually got a product called BrixFix, where we've combined actually fulvic acid, kelp, and triacontanol, and that's compatible with potassium silicate, so you can mix that, and that's what I do. I've got a very large, 18,000 tree apple farm, and one of my greatest tools is to put BrixFix and potassium silicate together so that I don't have the fungal disease pressure. Now, an interesting one that I've been looking at myself, because there's some quite good research on it, is calcium chloride at 1 to 200. So you're diluting at 1 litre in every 200 litres, half a litre per 100 litres. But calcium chloride with 300 grams of soluble fulvic acid powder is actually really good immunoelicitor. There's some very good research on tea in your country. You've probably seen it, you're probably familiar with it. But in one study, quite a large study, looking at blister blight, calcium chloride actually outperformed the fungicides. It was like an 85% control versus 75% with the fungicides, and the fungicides are getting more and more resistant. So calcium chloride to boost, and how's that working? The mode of action is that basically, that tells you how important calcium is. That when the plant occurs stress, so that can be abiotic stress, which is, water, waterlogging, for example, or too dry or cold or whatever, that's called abiotic stress, or biotic stress, which is your increase in fungal and insect pressure. But when a plant has that stress, encounters that stress, that triggers a release of calcium ions within the plant. There's a sudden big flow, a measurable increase in calcium ions in the plant, showing how important calcium is for disease resistance. And that triggers an immune response for the plant to fight against those two diseases. And so when you foliar spray calcium chloride, which unlike potassium chloride is uptaken well, and particularly when you put fulvic acid, which increases that uptake by 30%, then you get you've induced a flow of calcium ions which trigger an immune response. So calcium chloride is a very, very good option at 1 to 200. So then we'll look at the microbes for control for both blister blight and the secondaries with the leaf blights. Trichoderma has been well used. What we've found with trichoderma is a predatory organism, will actually eat the disease organisms involved, but also it releases 3 or 4 biochemicals that stimulate plant immunity. So it's kind of like a double hit. But what we found with trichoderma, we've looked at, I talk about sending the boys off to work with a lunchbox. If we put a microbial inoculum into the field, we put a food source with it. So it hits the ground running, colonizes more effectively, and does its job much more efficiently. And what we found is that lunchbox, what's the best lunchbox? Well, the obvious things would be fulvic acid and humic acid, and they are effective, but it's surprisingly, molasses is more effective. And we use higher rates, like 10 litres per hectare as a foliar, even as high as 20 litres per hectare. And you get this prolonged protection because you've got a food source ongoing for the trichoderma. And so it continues doing its control of disease for a much longer period. So we have a product called TrichoShield, which is available in India, which we've used in over 40 countries for quite some years successfully. Now, another immunoelicitor that's worth considering is something called chitinase. Now, that's usually sourced from extracts of sort of prawn shells and so forth. But basically, there's a really good organism that's, again, you can access freely in India. It's called Pseudomonas fluorescens. It's a bacteria called Pseudomonas fluorescens, and there's some really nice studies showing that you've got a double effect. Pseudomonas fluorescens produce some biochemicals that can actually kill blister blight, and interestingly can affect the tea mosquito bug. And have a look at the studies. Just Google Pseudomonas fluorescens and tea, and you'll see the research. But the secondary effect of Pseudomonas fluorescens is that it produces an enzyme called chitinase. So chitinase digests chitin. Now, I'm a really big fan of some of the key bacillus species. So, and you can even put them with Pseudomonas fluorescens, but because they're compatible. But these organisms are really multifunction. They can fix nitrogen. They can access some of your frozen reserves of phosphorus by solubilizing phosphorus. They're well-known boosters of plant immunity. You've probably heard of things like Bacillus subtilis, which is quite a well-researched immunoliciter. But these key ones that I'm a fan of, they also produce really large amounts, just like Pseudomonas fluorescens does. They produce large amounts of chitinase. And as I said, that's the enzyme that digests the chitin that comprises the outer wall of insects. So insects' outer wall is made of chitin, and so are pathogenic fungi, and so are the gut lining of the larvae that are part of that whole process of, in some cases, like the mosquito bug, the T mosquito bug has that larval stage. So the chitin will, if it eats a little bit of this organism, that will digest and destroy its gut. So pretty good story. And as we said, we already saw the research on Pseudomonas fluorescens. Well, I think there should be more work done on 5 species: Bacillus subtilis, Bacillus amyloliquefaciens, big word, but a hugely popular and well-researched organism. It's probably the superstar of these Bacillus species at the moment in terms of research into protective qualities. Bacillus pumilus, Bacillus megaterium, and Bacillus licheniformis. And we put them all together in a freeze-dried. Now, you've got to brew it for 24 hours on farm, and there's a food source you put with it. So it makes it very inexpensive, but it's called Microforce. And we've had such good results for both disease and insect control all over the planet with that product called Microforce. So it's a good option for you. So then we talked about minerals, we talked about microbes. And just to conclude, we also need to think about humus and how we can build humus. And our work with coffee in India, we taught the growers how to more efficiently digest residues, some of which had built up into huge amounts underneath in the coffee plantations. And we taught them, inoculums and strategies to break down that and turn it into humus. And that in itself created better crop resilience and healthier plants that were more resistant to disease and insects. So it's a really important part of this 3-part strategy: minerals, microbes, and humus, that we start looking at how we can build, so we can start using things like humic acid regularly in the soil, which stimulates fungi and gets things. And fungi, of course, create the stable form of humus. Bacteria create a less stable form. The humus created by fungi will last for a minimum of 35 years in your soil. So fungi become hugely important in this climate change challenge in terms of carbon sequestration, because they hold the stable carbon or create the stable carbon in the soil to keep it out of the atmosphere. Crop residues you want to digest if you've got any leaf that's laying on the ground and so forth. And so we like one organism that I'm not sure yet whether our guys in India have imported it, with the Nutri-Tech India imports it, but it's a product called BAM. It stands for Beneficial Anaerobic Microbes. It's become our largest selling microbial. We've got like 18 microbial products, and that's our largest seller. And basically, it's a perfect organism if the soils are tight and closed, because it's a blend of beneficial anaerobes that don't need oxygen. That's what your soils haven't got at the moment, but they'll go into those soils and they'll create crumb structure, and they'll open up and change the structure to allow the aerobic organisms to then start doing their thing. So they're perfect in tight closed soils. They're called beneficial anaerobic microbes. You can brew them on farm. You can make 1,000 litres, for example, or a 200-litre drum very, very cost effectively for cents a litre. And that's a very, very good thing to look at for your current problem, to use these. You might be able to source something else locally called EM, which is a Japanese invention, which is similar. Ours has got a few more species in it, but it will do a similar, perform a similar role in terms of opening closed, tight soils that have been, where the structure has been compromised through years and years of heavy rainfall. You need to get that soil breathing again. And these are the sort of strategies that we can look at to improve that. Compost farmyard manure will help to build both humus and microbial diversity. And as I mentioned, the microbial diversity is a huge story. We now understand that process called rhizophagy, where plants are actually getting over 50% of their soil from eating microbes. So the more microbes and the more diversity and the greater number of microbes, the better you will do. So you can't keep on bombing them all the time with these chemicals that are less and less effective and costing more and more money. You can see the sense of moving down a more regenerative pathway where you're working with that system. I mean, the definition of science in Webster's dictionary is adherence to natural laws and principles. You've got a perfect blueprint. You were supposed to learn from it, not saying we can do better than this. And we found that treating symptoms is not scientific. it means you use more and more for less and less response. And that's working across the board in all of our endeavors, whether we're talking, like if you look at dogs and veterinary science, for example, a dog in Australia in 1900 lived till 18. Now, we know that dogs have got a genetic potential of 23 because dogs have lived to that age. Not all of them, but some dogs can live to that ripe old age of 23. 18 was the average in 1900. We brought in veterinary science. We threw all the drugs and the flea treatments and whatever else. The average age of dogs in Australia is now 8. That's the bankruptcy of a symptom treating system. We want to get back to root causes and solve problems. So in conclusion, tea production in India has been characterized by high levels of N and K. Sometimes other minerals, including calcium, have been overlooked. What we're talking about is a holistic approach where the interplay of minerals, microbes, and humus determines profitability, resilience, and your need for chemical intervention. This is a win-win scenario where the soil, the grower, and the planet all benefit. So hopefully there's something of interest for you there. If you want to follow that further, you can just Google the Nutrition Farming Podcast, and you can hear much, much more detail about all of the things we've talked about. But I'll take questions now if you have any questions you'd like to ask.
Well, thank you, Graeme Sait. I think it was a very interesting presentation. Like you, in your conclusion, what you mentioned, the NK was the primary driver. Of course, most of these nutrients, what you mentioned, boron, calcium, molybdenum, all these things we are applying based on the soil analysis, based on the inputs from the Upasi's TRI, which is quite actively involved in the team growing in this area. But then one thing is a correlation between the application and the absorption, where any of these nutrients, how it play out is what one of the interesting dimensions you have brought in. And also it is interesting to note that you also developed certain meters and measurable tools which can be made as an applicability at the farmers or the growers end, which is very interesting.
Charan, if I just interrupt for a minute, did the growers typically use tissue testing or not?
We are testing the soils.
You don't test the leaf at all?
We do test the leaf. If you want Dr. Victor, who is our director of TRI, to respond, he may probably add to what you asked. Victor, would you like to comment on that?
Because I honestly couldn't conceive of not testing, my own farms. I've got 2 farms, but all the farmers I work with, tissue testing is at least as important as soil testing, because basically it's going to be quite different from the soil test because of the interplay of minerals and how one mineral affects another. So you really need to ask the crop, what do you want, crop, and then respond accordingly. So the leaf testing is really important. If you pick up nothing from this presentation, that's probably the most important thing. If you're not doing it, you need to start doing it, in my opinion. It's not just my opinion.
Victor, would you like to say something on that?
Yes, sir. Thank you. First of all, I thank Mr. Graeme Sait for an enlightening presentation, and to answer to our chairman's remark on the methodology that we follow in South India to analyze the leaf and soil nutrient status. We do analysis for the major nutrients both in soil and in leaf, and also a few of the minor elements, the micro elements. But what we do not give importance is on like molybdenum and then silica. These 2-3 minerals are not generally analyzed in our institute or in our protocol for checking the leaf and soil nutrient status. So by and large, we analyze for the major and a few of the trace elements, both in soil and leaf.
Yeah, Doctor, if I may just come in here, I think the question Graeme is asking is, how often do you do the leaf testing? Do you test before doing any spray? Is it a regular exercise? Is it something you do once a month, once in 15 days, once in 2 months, 3 months, or once a year?
It is occasional, sir. It is not at a fixed interval, or it is not at frequent intervals as the speaker has advised.
The one thing
point.
The one thing I'll share relative to silica is because there have been 9 international silica conferences in the last 10 years, the most recent in China. But basically, because it's so relatively new for tissue testing, there aren't the 30 years of research determining ideal guidelines. But what we've found with our agronomy teams is that if we can get above 800, if you just remember this figure, 800 parts per million in all crops, that seems to be the turning point in terms of resilience. So 800 parts per million of silica on a tissue test, on a dry leaf test, where that seems to give you that resistance.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, Victor.
Mr. Graeme Sait, to further get a clear clarification from your side, see, in South India, in tea cultivation, the practice or the recommendation of the institute is to apply the nutrients, the major nutrients like nitrogen and potassium, 4 times in a year, on an average, 4 splits in a year.
Okay.
And what is your suggestion for the leaf and soil test to analyze it when we apply for 4 times in a year?
So basically, I would be using a nitrogen meter, as the in-field guideline for your requirements. But just in terms of improving the efficiency of those 4 applications of nitrogen, particularly considering, I don't know what the price is over in your neck of the woods, but we've had a trebling in price of urea here. I think you've got government subsidies there, but our urea for our farmers on this side of the world and in the US, Canada, and Europe, basically it's been a 3 times increase in the price of urea. So really important that we maximize the stability and efficiency of urea. So with those 4 applications, we would always, if you're going to do it in the soil, we would always be putting soluble humic acid granules at 5% with that urea. That creates a urea humate that is stable. It can't volatilize, it can't leach. It's taken in, it's a very good study out of Malaysia, just the start of last year, where it was a 61% increase in urea efficiency when they added humic acid to the urea. So that's number one, but even more important, and I didn't cover it, I'm cursing now that I didn't cover it in my talk, is the importance and the validity of foliar spraying urea as the most efficient single way of applying nitrogen to the crop. So normally when you put urea into the soil, it begins life as an amide or amine. Very rapidly, as soon as it hits the soil, is converted with the urease enzyme into ammonium nitrogen, and then very shortly after that, nitrifying bacteria convert most of it into nitrates and pump it into the plant. So that's the process. Now, when it gets into the plant, there's a very energy-intensive process involving the nitrate reductase enzyme to convert those nitrates through to the first stage of protein, and then it goes click. So there's 3 stages to get from a nitrate to a protein. The first stage is the very energy intensive. Some say it's as much as 18% of photosynthetic energy just to convert the nitrate through to an amine, and then it's very energy efficient to go from an amine to an amino acid and then to a protein. So urea starts life as an amide. You can foliar spray that straight into the leaf 12 times more efficiently, always with some humic acid to buffer it and increase its uptake, only small amounts. You foliar spray the urea, and it's just this very, very super efficient. There's no off-gassing because you've created a urea humate that can't off-gas. You've got this uptake increased by 1/3 because humic acid increases uptake by 1/3. And you've got this amide that's converted bang straight through to an amino acid and a protein. So it's the most efficient way you can put nitrogen on by far. There's nothing comes close. You can monitor it with meters and with leaf tests, and you'll see how efficient it is. And it dramatically reduces the cost of nitrogen fertilizing. And of course, this problem of agriculture putting up 80% of the nitrous oxide into the atmosphere through mismanagement of highly volatile materials like urea. So either if you are going to do it in the soil, you put humic acid with it. If you're doing it on the leaf, foliar spray, it's by far the most effective and the most cost effective. Just do a little patch for yourself. We've got growers all over the planet who have switched to urea foliars and are saying it's the best thing they ever did. So just try it yourself and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Thank you. Like I mentioned in the beginning, we have got a whole host of questions. As Mr. Graeme said, about 81 participants were there, and I'm sure there are about, when I count, about 30 odd questions which come in the chat box. How would you like to take it? Would you like to go through the chat box and answer each one of them, or would you want me to read out those questions for you to respond?
It's probably easier for me to just answer them here. It's just that I've got a huge program myself coming up over the next few days where I've just got meetings constantly, so I just wouldn't have the time to do it within the next week or two. So probably I can answer some of them now. It's quicker than me sitting there and have to. I'm not a very fast typer, and I don't have a personal assistant at the moment. I'm interviewing for personal assistants. I've been without a personal assistant for the last 5 weeks, and I'm really struggling trying to fly solo because I'm a slow typer, and I'm, so I'll prefer if there's the opportunity I can answer some of them anyway now, and then I'll try and answer the rest of them.
Maybe what I can do is I've captured it and bucketed it so that there's no repetition. I can probably throw some questions to you, which is bundled up, and then probably their answers. And if anything more, they can always respond to you. Does it sound okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's good.
Maybe we can exit this presentation screen so that there's more visibility of the participants.
Okay. I'm just not quite sure how to, because everyone's, Nutri-Tech is.
Fair enough. I'll get going with this.
Everyone's gone home now, so I'll just see. So do I cut the screen sharing out?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, we have got business leaders in this, planters in this. You have doctors and scientists from the TRI, and also from the various organizations. So it's a very mixed set of people, and all of them are practicing growers primarily from tea. So I've just bucketed a few of these questions, which is major. And then probably I'll throw it on to you, and then if there's anything more, we can take it from there.
That's great.
Yeah. So the first few questions were on all this organic versus inorganic, and then what are the success stories? I mean, everybody is fearing about the drop in the yield, and you are saying that the OM status of soil is very, very crucial, and about 25 earthworms per shovel is what is the population you are. It's a healthy population.
That's right.
So all of that together, can you recommend what is the best way to go forward? On one side, you have chemical fertilizer, and the other side, the need of the organic fertilizer there, and the improvement in soil health. So can you elaborate on the this aspect of organic?
Okay, so obviously there's an increasing consumer awareness of the chemicals that are present in the food we're consuming, and there's quite a lot of research suggesting that we should try and avoid them where we can. So there's certainly in our country, we've got a couple of organic tea producers that are doing tremendously well because everyone wants organic tea. So it's a very good thing to consider. And as I mentioned, I mentioned in that case, the case of the world's largest berry growers and their organic divisions out yielding their conventional division. So it doesn't mean you've got to sacrifice yield. It's just understanding that if you're doing soil and leaf tests, I'm doing, particularly tissue tests are so important. If you're going to go organic, you've got no crutches. You've got to have everything right. So you need to be doing regular tissue tests to know exactly what you've got and to maintain that optimum nutrition at all times. And that's best done through foliars. It's just, I don't know how easy that is for you, whether you even use foliars, but it's really important. Fast tracking, direct injection through correcting things with foliars. So yeah. Sorry, I just have a mouthful of water. So the organic story with nitrogen, for example, which of course is the most abundant mineral, so we've got to take care of that when we've got a vegetative crop like tea. So basically that comes back to the use of farmyard manures, particularly the use of nitrogen fixing. Now there's some very good products in your country, produced in your country, we market them, that are based on azotobacter that can live on the leaf surface and successfully fix nitrogen directly from the atmosphere. They survive for about a month, and they fix nitrogen directly into the leaf very, very cost effectively. Now, the problem with those, the only issue that you've got to be aware of when you're using any kind of nitrogen fixing inoculum is that you've got to have molybdenum, and so many soils don't have, because they can't operate. They can't make nitrogenase without molybdenum. So even if you put just tiny amounts of sodium molybdate in with them when you're utilizing them, you will have a much better response. Similarly, when we're using inoculums like that, we like to put them out with a food source. So if we're going to put out a nitrogen fixer like azotobacter onto the leaf surface, we will put a little bit of sugar, a little bit of molasses, and perhaps the most powerful bacterial stimulant is called fulvic acid. So we'll put fulvic acid with the azotobacter on the leaf surface to fix nitrogen directly into that plant. Now, you can also use azotobacter in the soil. You can fertigate azotobacter and fix nitrogen, but again, you've got to make sure that you've got molybdenum or they simply won't work. So that becomes the strategy. Then you can use, there are quite an increasing number of amino acid blends that amino acids, again, foliar sprayed, much more cost effective than putting in the soil. That's what these the large berry growers with the $1.5 billion of organic berries, their primary nitrogen comes from a combination of nitrogen fixers and amino acids foliar sprayed on the leaf. So that's the secret from a nitrogen perspective.
Right. One sub-question there is about the relationship of pH with the OM status. So does it have any correlation from somewhere in your presentation, an optimum level of 6.4 or 6.4 percentage, 6.4 recording of the pH will help the overall uptake of the minerals. But OM, yes. What is the relationship with the OM on that?
What the relationship of what? So, the organic matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, organic matter, is the house, the home base for microorganisms, and of course, we now understand the plant's actually eating microorganisms for half of its nutrition. So the higher the organic matter, the more microorganisms you're assuming are present, unless you've killed them all in that organic matter. But that can now be monitored. Those machines are less than $300, so they're not hugely expensive. These little microbiometers that can measure total microbial biomass. It's so important to take the guesswork out of the scenario by saying, okay, this is my best block, this is my best, just to get your own confidence, take your most productive block and your least productive block, and always there will be 6 or 7 times difference between them. And then you say, okay, well, what works? I'm going to try this. And then you measure, did it work? So you've actually got a monitoring tool to know in your conditions in your soil what has given you the best response. That's why people have got so excited with cover crops, because they see these huge increases in total microbial biomass following a multi-species cover crop, or substances like humic and fulvic acid and so forth as tools to build total microbial numbers in the soil. And just know that the higher your numbers, the better you'll do, basically. And you'll see that for yourself if you've got one of these meters, or even get one that you can share between you, between different groups nearby, sort of thing. You'll see exactly your best blocks are the highest readings. Microbes determine your profitability. And what you're going to find is that your fungi to bacteria ratio is going to be terrible, because you've used fungicides more and more to try and during these four years of wet, and you need to bring back the fungi into the equation.
Right. Then there's a whole host of questions on the, I'll just bundle it up. So there's a lot of talks on the earthworm and how that is improving the soil status and the microbial status. And the questions are, is glyphosate having an adverse effect on the earthworm population? Number 2, the shade pattern in the coffee estates, both as a coffee bush as well as the shade trees. Does it have a impact on the digestive system and the earthworm population? And there's also how to check the load of microbes in the soil and the
how to check. Sorry, the last one was how to check the what?
How to check the load of microbes in the soil.
Oh, yeah. So that's where we're using this simple little tool, new tool called a microbiometer, that's become something of an international phenomenon. So simple to use. It's quite fascinating, and it seems to correlate with other monitoring techniques, but it's a very simple way that you can measure the total microbial biomass, which is what you've got, how big is your workforce, is what you're asking the question. So that's the tool to monitor that and see where you're at. I mean, you can use DNA analysis and get more precise, but what we find is that the higher you're reading in total microbial biomass, which is the load of microbes in the soil, the better you'll do. And it's always the case. It's not sometimes, it's always the best block will have the highest reading. Now, the highest reading I've ever measured was 2,200 was the reading on the meter. That's the highest ever in the world that I've measured. And that guy had a 1 acre greenhouse producing $1.27 million per year from a 1 acre greenhouse. That's the highest production I've ever seen. And that's how it correlates. The best soils are the most productive and have the highest number of microbes in them. You're farming microbes. Just wrap your head around that and life changes. But sorry, I've forgotten the other two questions that you asked at the start.
One is the glyphosate impact on the...
Yes, so it's a huge issue. I think you've got to be aware that it's difficult because, I mean, I'm farming with nutrition farming. I'm not farming organically certified, but I still won't use glyphosate on my farms. There's, the one thing to be aware of is that it's not going to be here within the next 2 to 3 years. I mean, Europe's already almost banned it. By the end of this year, it'll be banned in Europe. It is an absolute proven class 1 carcinogen now. I had dinner with the head of Bayer in Australia some time back, and I said to him, it must be uncomfortable I thought there were 5,000 lawsuits from people who had got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from glyphosate. He said, try 15,000 and several hundred more each week that are coming in. So Bayer have got themselves into quite some trouble relative to that chemical, but the chemical will have to go. It's just too dangerous. It's just, it's really harsh. Now, there are all sorts of debates about its impact, but it does seem that it's affecting mycorrhizal fungi. There are some bacteria that actually increase in number after glyphosate, and they don't know whether that's good or bad, but fungi are the creatures we're most concerned about, are most definitely impacted. I mean, I work with a research institute in Ireland, and they do the microbiology under cider apple trees that have been sprayed with glyphosate for many years, and they said it's just a dead zone after years of glyphosate application. It's really, really hard on soil life. So, if there's any other options, there are tricks. Everything, this approach is very much a pragmatic approach. And the secret to using glyphosate doesn't make it, I don't really even like telling people the secret because it's such of a dog of a chemical. It's going to go. You might as well start looking for other alternatives now. But the secret to using glyphosate and getting rid of, fast tracking the biodegradation of the residue so it doesn't continue doing the damage, and to use less when you use it, is to combine fulvic acid, 100 grams of soluble fulvic acid powder per hectare with your glyphosate, and then use citric acid to drop the pH. So there's a really important thing with chemicals, that all chemicals have a sweet spot. Now, that there's a pH at which they're most effective. Now, that can be dramatic. If you look at something like diethane, I don't know what the active ingredients, but diethane is the world's most popular fungicide. Diethane at, say, using tank water, just using bore water with a pH of 7, the half-life of diethane at pH 7 is 18 hours, which means it stays active for a day and a half, double 18 hours. If you drop the pH down to the sweet spot for that particular chemical, which is 5.2, so you use citric acid as the cheapest and most effective way to drop the pH, and it takes 100 grams per 100 litres to drop 1 pH point, roughly. So you take your 7 down to 5.2, diethane suddenly has a half-life of 18 days, which means it's protected for double that. So it means you've got a month protection versus a day and a half protection just by changing the pH. Now, the finding with glyphosate is that the sweet spot from a pH perspective for glyphosate is 2.9. It's the lowest of all chemicals. So at 2.9, you can use immediately 30% less glyphosate, which is great. You're putting out less of that stuff into your soil to do all the damage that it does. So, and then if you add fulvic acid to it, you can cut it in half. You can use half, because fulvic acid, the story with fulvic acid combined with glyphosate is that fulvic acid is very well researched. There are 12 published papers showing that fulvic acid, it's a phenomenon called cell sensitization, where the cell membrane through which things move through the cell wall in through the cell membrane becomes more permeable, 30 to 34% more permeable in the presence of either humic or fulvic. But fulvic is what you use with glyphosate, because fulvic is a genuine acid. Humic acid is alkaline, and you don't want to put something alkaline with glyphosate, because you're taking with one hand, giving with one, and taking with the other, because it works less effectively in alkaline conditions. So you always use fulvic with glyphosate to increase the uptake by 30%, which means you can use 30% less. But then it's combined. Fulvic acid has a CC of 1400. That's one of the highest known cation exchange capacities. It means it can suck things into it. And what's been shown is that the glyphosate sort of bonds with fulvic. And once it's done its killing job, fulvic is the most powerful bacterial stimulant. Humic stimulates fungi, fulvic stimulates bacteria. And so they'll come like bees to a honeypot to that fulvic glyphosate bond, and they'll fast track the biodegradation of the glyphosate residues through like bees to a honeypot to chasing the fulvic, but in the process biodegrading the glyphosate that's tied to it. So really good strategy. Just 100 grams of soluble fulvic acid powder with your glyphosate is a really good strategy.
Right.
So that would bring it down to, let's say, 35%.
Yes,
by
so
adding
that immediately pulls it back by a third. We've got growers everywhere who put the fulvic with it and pull back by 30% they start with. So if they're using 3 litres, they're using 2 litres, or if they're using 2 litres, they're using 1.3 litres. You cut back by a third. For 30% is what our growers will normally start with. And then when they add citric acid and drop the pH down, they can pull back even more, usually to about half the amount they were using previously.
Okay, thanks.
Right. So that's thank you for that. And next is also connected to that. I think there are many questions around the humic acid and the compost. I'll just take one of that, and members would like to know what's the difference between the humic acid and compost, and which one do you think is more effective? Humic acid addition or a compost addition is what which would be prefer, and why?
Well, it's really interesting. Like humic and fulvic acids are natural components of composting, but in very tiny amounts. So the humic acid that you're using commercially, that's extracted from ancient organic matter in the forms of certain types of brown coal, and you add. That's weird because humic acid is only soluble in alkaline conditions. So you add potassium hydroxide to the brown coal with water. You can actually do it yourself, but it's a bit messy. And you extract the humic acid and the fulvic acid, because fulvic acid is also soluble in alkaline conditions. So both of those are now in a black liquid that you've extracted from the brown coal in super high concentrates, much, much higher than what you would find in compost, many, many times more. And then to separate the two, because you want to use them for different purposes, then you put an acid, it might be phosphoric acid or vinegar or whatever, citric acid, you drop that into the humic acid, and the humic acid forms into this thick blank gunk on the bottom, and the golden brown liquid that remains on the top is fulvic acid, which stays soluble. It's a genuine acid. It's soluble in acid or alkaline conditions. So you pull it out of the brown coal with an alkaline extraction, and then you add the acid and separate it off, and then you alkalize the sludge on the bottom after you've taken off the fulvic acid to create a soluble humic acid again. So that's just how they do it when you're extracting it from brown coal. But the end result is that it's much, much more concentrated forms than what you can get. Compost has got small amounts of those natural acids. This is and the gain is that you can add them. The simple research on it is that it increases this, both humic and fulvic increase cell sensitization, and both can stabilize and chelate, this thing called chelation. Both humic and fulvic can chelate minerals. So you can put them with your minerals. You can take a little bit of fulvic acid and put it with zinc sulfate or calcium nitrate and create a zinc fulvate or a manganese fulvate or a calcium fulvate. And now you've got a chelated form of calcium that you did yourself really inexpensively. That's probably the biggest way that fulvic acid, for example, is used. Everyone creates their own chelated do-it-yourself fertilizers with a good quality fulvic acid. So yeah, that's the difference. But in terms of just their physical difference, fulvic acid is 10 times smaller molecular size than humic acid. And so humic acid can't leach. So in sandy soils, humic acid will stay there. Fulvic acid can leach and does. So fulvic acid generally in lighter soils is used on the leaf with things to chelate them and magnify them, and it's got all its own benefits in terms of biostimulation and so forth. But humic acid, you imagine if you've got a sandy soil with a CC of say 4, it's a light sandy soil, can't hold, it's got no humus, it's got very low levels of organic matter, so it's got no holding capacity, and you put humic acid with your urea or with any other nutrient that would otherwise leach, and humic acid can't leach. So you've now created a
Hello?
urea rate that can't leach so readily.
Yeah, can I call you back? I'm in a meeting. I'll just call you back.
Sanjit, can you mute, please? Yeah, sure. Thanks on that. I think we have got some interesting, very look forward questions coming with regard to the pest and disease management. Before that was the 5 productive add-ons which you have really mentioned, saying that how chloride and silicon and molybdenum, cobalt and silicon has really played a big role in the absorption and the cell building. And like Dr. Victor, our director, has mentioned, very often these are not really fully looked into by many of the growers. Some of them they may be doing, but majority are not looking into the silicon and molybdenum, silica and molybdenum part of it. And otherwise, we play on that. But then according to your presentation, it is playing a big role, and how that is going to play out in the absorption, and how calcium is playing out for the absorption of many of these 8 minerals, what you mentioned. So one of the big question which came from there, what is the kind of ratios? Is it again based on the leaf analysis and the soil analysis that you make a recommendation? And is it then applied foliar, or is it through the ground?
So the ratio story, that's a good question. The ratio story is about soil ratios within the soil on a soil test. So when we talk about the calcium to magnesium ratio, that's based upon the ratio between those 2 minerals in the soil. So then the correction of those ratios, so there's 2 ways you can approach it depending on what your budget is. Ideally, if you've got low calcium and you need to have 2 tons of lime per hectare, then you put out 2 tons of lime per hectare. But if you can't afford that, then you know that you're going to need some foliar calcium to compensate. Or it might be you're lacking both calcium and magnesium, and you might need, say, 2 tons or 2.5 tons or 1.5 tons or whatever. There's an appropriate amount based upon what your soil needs, but you might need calcium and magnesium, which means you'd use dolomite, for example. But if you can't afford to correct that, and you know that you've got low magnesium and calcium, and they're 2 of the big 4, then you're going to foliar spray those. You're going to foliar spray some magnesium sulfate, which is fairly inexpensive. You always put fulvic acid with it to create a magnesium fulvate, and that's a really effective way to address magnesium. And you can do calcium, the same story. You use calcium nitrate, put some fulvic acid, and so you can gauge your nutritional requirements based on the soil test. Of course, you can confirm that with a tissue test, but the soil test, you either get in there and fix it if you can afford to, if you had a good season and you can fix it, because it stays fixed for a long time. Once you fix your cal-mag ratio, you don't go back next year and fix it again. It lasts for several years, the effect of that balancing. But it's based, everyone's got a budget and it's what you can afford. So if you've got a series of trace mineral deficiencies in the soil, you could correct. You need 5 parts per million of zinc. That might be a bag of zinc sulfate to lift your zinc levels from 2 parts per million to a minimum of 5, for example. That might be 20 kilos of zinc sulfate. I mean, I teach in my courses, and if you listen to the podcast, how you work out exactly how much of everything. It's much more detailed. There's not time to go into all of that sort of thing. But so then, but if you haven't got that budget to fix it in the soil, then you make sure that you address it in the leaf, or you address it fertigation wise, or however you're going to put your nutrition on.
Yeah, so just connected to that, the pH of the soil, mostly tea soils are between 4.5 to 5 in many of the growing districts. And if that's the case, do you think that there's an absorption challenge for the plant when the levels are low, and therefore these minerals won't be available?
Well, I think that 4.5 is calcium chloride that you're talking, because it would be way too low. Otherwise, you wouldn't grow anything. So if it was water pH, so that's a point higher, which means it's 5.5 to 6. And 5.5 is too low. It definitely creates problems with the uptake of actually most of the major minerals, 4 or 5 of the major minerals. If you look at that chart, you'll see. I'll send over the PDF of that presentation so that you've got all of that data on hand, and you can just share it with your members. So that you can see those charts and things like that. But I mean, But essentially, yes, you've compromised so many things with something as basic as pH that you're a point away from where you need to be, and it's logarithmic. So that point makes a huge difference in uptake. Every 0.1 of a point has that effect. Logarithmic means it's a really major impact when you're a whole point out. When you're water, I'm suggesting you're going to be water pH, because there's two types of pH. Water pH is 1 point roughly higher than calcium chloride. And I think you're talking calcium chloride when you talk about those low figures. But if you're talking 4.5 to 5.5, well, you're talking 5.5 or maybe to 6. And 5.5 is just too low. You shouldn't be growing a major crop like that. You're just, you're really creating your own nightmare. That needs to be fixed.
So most of them are using this dolomite and the other form of calcium carbonate. Is there any other direct, because of the low levels, to correct it in a shorter term? Would you recommend some sort of foliar application?
The simple thing in terms of choice of inputs to correct that is that calcium carbonate's got 40% calcium. So limestone, calcium carbonate, not dolomite, calcium carbonate is 400 kilos per ton that you're correcting, that you're putting back into that soil. Dolomite is half of that. It's 200 kilos of calcium and 100 kilos of magnesium is the usual kind of analysis. So you never use dolomite if you've got enough magnesium. That's one mistake that people make. You never put more magnesium into the equation, because it's going to shut down potassium. It's going to actually affect calcium uptake if you've got too much magnesium. So dolomite's only applicable if you need both calcium and...
Shant, can I request you to please mute? Thanks.
Sorry, what was that?
Please go on.
Yeah, so the choice is based upon, you only put on what you need. You're never going to put more magnesium onto soil that's got high magnesium or got enough magnesium, because it's actually toxic then, because magnesium antagonizes the uptake of potassium, of ammonium, nitrogen, of calcium in that instance if there's too much magnesium. So you don't put more on. So it's just understanding the balance of how soils work. That's really important. And then choose so say that you needed, you could say that you needed some calcium, some magnesium, and some sulfur. Then your calcium requirements could be divided between lime, dolomite, and gypsum. You can put a little bit of each into that scenario, and you're doing three things at once, because gypsum, of course, is calcium sulfate, and it's giving you the sulfur component. So that's how you would determine what you're going to use. And so, but still within the realms of, I need, I'll just explain, this is getting a bit into the agronomy fields, but a part per million, just so that you know when you're looking at your soil test, 1 part per million is roughly 1 kilo per acre. So if you look at a soil test and it says, a good soil test, like our soil test will tell you, you've got 1,500 parts per million of calcium in that soil, and what you need for your particular soil type, your ideal that you're chasing, is 1,900 parts per million, so that you need 400 kilos per acre of calcium, because you're 1,500 up to 1,900 is 400. Well, that's a ton. That's a ton per acre, and then you want it per hectare, so you multiply it by 2.5, and it's 2.5 tons per hectare has fixed your soil. That's given you the 400 parts per million they're lacking. So that's how you can work out anything if you want to get back to become your own agronomist, is that if you've got 4 parts per million of zinc and you need 5 parts per million, 1 part per million is 1 kilo of zinc per acre. That's just how it works out. So you need 1 part per million if you're 4 and you need to be 5 of zinc. So you need, so basically then you say, okay, well, that's complete zinc, but zinc sulfate's only 33% zinc. So I need 3 kilos of zinc sulfate per acre to make 1 kilo of zinc. And then you say, but I want it per hectare. Well, then you multiply 3 by 2.5, and 7.5 kilos of zinc sulfate fixes your problem, takes you from 4 up to 5. That's how you work it out. A part per million per acre.
Next, one interesting question, I think, about this new dimension, what you brought in for the pest incidence or pest population to increase, is the higher usage of nitrogen. From experience, that you find that the usage of nitrogen, excessive usage or indiscriminate use of nitrogen, is causing the increasing incidence of pest, and that's one question. I think a lot of questions.
it's really important to understand the mechanics or mechanisms of that. First thing to understand is you put urea out there, most of it goes in the form of nitrates. It goes through that conversion, and most of what goes into the plant is in the nitrate form of nitrogen. And nitrate is always uptaken with water. That's just the nature of nitrates. So when you've got high nitrates, there was a lot of water that carried it in, and that creates a dilution effect. So nitrates, if you've got too much of them in the equation, more than what's needed at that time for the crop cycle, and you've just said, oh, if a bit works good, I'll put more on. That's called the more-on approach. But basically with nitrogen, if you've taken it in with water, what you see on a refractometer where you're measuring dissolved solids, when you put out a whole heap of urea, if you've overdone it, you'll see your Brix level, your dissolved solids drop substantially. They'll drop right back. They'll be 12 and they'll drop back to 7. That's because of the dilution effect of the water that carried in the nitrates, and that's what calls in the insects. Insects' role in the scheme of things is that they're garbage collectors. That's their role. I mean, there's a very famous American scientist called Professor Phil Callahan, who wrote a book that was a game changer for many. It was called Tuning into Nature. And what Phil showed us was that plants emit an infrared radiation, we now have drones that can measure that infrared radiation, but he was the man that discovered it. And a healthy, well-balanced plant sends a steady flow of this radiation, and an unbalanced plant sends a staccato. Zzz, zzz, zzz. So a plant that's overfilled with nitrogen and everything's diluted, so it's a substandard plant because of that dilution, sends out a staccato flow. And insects, the feelers on insects, and this is Phil's other sort of research, are not feelers, are hugely important antennae. And you could blow them up as we do in our courses, and it's like this hugely obvious antenna. It can't be anything else. It's what it is, and they're all different. They make a television aerial look like a kindergarten toy in comparison. And the insect's flying over a crop, using his antenna to use it for all sorts of things, picking up pheromones to know who he can mate with, for example, with the antenna on his feelers, but also picking up infrared radiation, determining where its food source is going to come from. And so it flies across a well-balanced plant and the steady flow, and it says, that's not my role, and flies past, and it flies across a plant that's been just fed with a whole bunch of nitrogen, diluted with the water that carries in the nitrates, and it's got a staccato infrared radiation. And the insect says, yes. And then he comes to perform his role in the scheme of things. He's a garbage collector. He's there to improve the overall gene pool. You create garbage, and the garbage collector arrives to do his job. Now go online and check locust plagues, where whole fields have been knocked out, and there's a field right in the middle of them with not a touch, and that's the high Brix field. There's multiple examples online that you can check. So that's why refractometers are so important. The higher your Brix level, the lower your insect pressure. You will never see an exception. You go to one field where you've got insect pressure and another where you haven't. The field with insect pressure will always, you call me, I will guarantee this, always the field with insect pressure will have a lower Brix level, lower dissolved solids, and not always, but commonly linked to nitrogen, because nitrogen is diluted. You put too much nitrogen, you diluted that nutrient density and called in the insects to perform their role in things. The deal is that sugars that are measured, of course, part of what you're measuring with Brix levels with the dissolved solids, sugars, certain types of sugars for insects convert into alcohol in their gut and kill them. Their whole role of being is to reproduce. That's what you're there for. That's what your apparatus is about. How can I reproduce successfully? So you're not going to lay your egg on something with high sugars that's going to kill your baby with the alcohol it creates in the gut. So you choose the substandard plants that, in some cases, because of nitrogen diluting the nutrient density, that's how it works. It's just important to understand that.
Yeah, just connected one more question to that on this Brix value, where you measure the sugar levels or the kind of availability of various nutrients. You require the sugar for breaking down the glucose and fructose into various absorption levels. At the same time, you're saying the increasing of sugar is increasing the infestation or the pest infestation. So where do you kind of draw a line in your theory of Brix value administration of this?
There's a whole, it's quite a long involved story, but it's a whole pathway of the sugars involved between, there's a link, for example, with sucrose synthase is the enzyme that's produced from manganese. So there's this whole link to increased pressure if you dropped out manganese. And one of the big issues with, I'm just digressing here for a minute, but one of the big issues that I didn't cover with the findings on glyphosate, and the reason I don't use it in my orchard, is that glyphosate kills a group of organisms on contact really quite dramatically, and has for a long time, called manganese-reducing organisms. And it's slightly less harsh, about half as harsh, on a second group of organisms called iron-reducing organisms. Now, there's very good studies on this. You can just check it yourself. So you kill the manganese-reducing organisms, you reduce the uptake of manganese, and that has quite an impact on plant immunity. There are quite a range of enzymes, including phytoalexins, which are a central measure of immune competency, are manganese-based. So there's this a whole link to what glyphosate is reducing resilience dramatically. You've got less, you're going to have much less resilience if you're using glyphosate. That's why I'll never use it on my orchards, on my farms. I've got ordinary farms as well as orchards. So I've lost the question. Oh yeah, so the story with the sugars is there's a really strong manganese link in there in terms of that disease thing, because of the sucrase enzyme that's got a manganese link, because it's about the type of sugars that you've got, reducing versus non-reducing sugars, that one group of sugars attracts insects, and the next stage up doesn't. And then there's also another whole involved story of amino acids and their role in the scheme of things, but I won't go into that whole story at the moment. I'm sorry, I've got another appointment shortly, so I'm going to have to go in a few minutes' time. But it's 5 o'clock, and I think I've got.
Yeah, I know. We're just short of 2 minutes from the scheduled time. I fully respect that.
That's right. Yeah, I've just got to.
Many more questions which is coming. Maybe we will send that to you when you get time. Would you be kind enough to?
I've got a couple of minutes left. Like you say, I've got to be at it's 5 o'clock over here, and I've got at 5:30. I've got to drive about 15 minutes. So I've got 5 or 10 minutes.
If it's okay, 2 more questions. Is it okay?
Yes, no problems.
Yeah. So continuous harvesting in tea of the green leaf. How does a Brix value have a role there? Because you're harvesting it on every 12 to 15 days. So where do you think the Brix value will play around in that kind of a scenario?
Well, it's just understanding if you look at Brix and you say, what are the most important minerals that will lift Brix levels? Calcium's a huge player in that story, and you're taking calcium off every 15 days. That's why I'm just saying it's really important that you introduce some chelated foliar calcium in there to compensate, because you're stripping. I mean, it's different, but it's a South African. I mean, I kind of revolutionized the industry. They have a big party for me every time I go to South Africa, up in the Clan William region. It's called rooibos tea. So they took this little plant from the wild plant that had been used by the natives forever medicinally, and then they planted all in rows, and then they found that it's hugely popular because it's got no caffeine, but it's got very high antioxidants, just as high as tea. So it's become a very popular tea. But they were having problems that at 2 years they started, the fungal disease would come in, and then at 5 years they have to push it out and start again. And I said, well, this is ridiculous. You've got to do some tissue tests. You've got to see what's happening. The obvious thing that I'm suspecting is that you're taking this bush. They say, well, it doesn't happen out in the bush. In the wild, it can last for 40 years. Yeah, but you're not stripping the leaf off it several times a season, and you're not removing the big thing that determines resilience, which is calcium, because calcium is structural. Every leaf that you take off and you're removing calcium, you've got to put it back. Because it's so immobile, you've got to foliar spray calcium back into that scenario to compensate for what you're removing constantly. That's what I'm arguing.
Right. Thank you. One more question is application of calcium and silica. You said that it will be very helpful for strengthening the cell wall, and that will kind of help in the blister blight disease management and the improved general health of the bush. So this silica application, I don't think we have been really working on. What is your experience? Where have you got these trials, and how do you think that this is really going to help the blister blight management?
If you just Google silica now yourself, if you've not used it before, just Google research into silica, and you'll say, oh my goodness, what have we missed out on here? When you look at just huge numbers of papers now that are showing silica as an immunoliciter, which is huge because it increases yield as well, but silica as the principal cell strengthener along with calcium. So we use calcium, silica, and boron. You can't combine them because calcium and silica are not compatible. So you've got to do your foliar calcium and boron together, then you do your silica. And when you do your silica spray, your potassium silicate spray, you include, you don't have to, but it just works better. You include some fulvic, some kelp, some soluble kelp powder, some soluble fulvic acid powder with that potassium silicate and a little bit of tricontinol. And tricontinol is just this. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with tricontinol, but if you've not played around with tricontinol on tea, you need to start playing around with it. It's very inexpensive. Well, our product is very inexpensive, but basically tricontinol's mode of action is that it boosts every aspect. You know, it's in tiny amounts. We use 30 mils a hectare, so it's 2 tablespoons a hectare. But what it does, it depends on the strength. With it, you know, you might not have them that strong over there, but basically its mode of action is that it boosts every aspect of photosynthesis. So, you know, that's what produces the leaf. You know, that's what produces everything is photosynthesis. So it increases stomatal opening, it increases chlorophyll density, it increases the phosphate-based enzymes that make sugar, their performance. It's just like if you were to dream up the perfect plant growth promotant and say, okay, well, this is what I want, it would be tricontinol. It's extracted from the outer fat, waxy coating of the lucerne plant, or the alfalfa, the Americans call it, and a couple of other plants have it as well. Pardon me, but it's really, really effective. So that's what I would put, just so, you know, like when I'm spraying on my orchards, I want to put as many things as possible to get as much impact, because you're paying for diesel to go over and do it and so forth. You might be doing it by hand, I'm not sure. But so if you're going to do potassium silicate, you will put kelp, fulvic, and tricontinol with it, and you get a lovely response.
Thank you so much for all those valuable inputs. And I'm sure there is a lot of thought process which is now going to be working within both the practicing planters as well as our scientists. We will be certainly interacting with you going forward, because you brought in a complete new dimension and a new approach to the holistic way of managing the pest and disease and also the soil health. I know for the paucity of time, I am unable to open this to everybody for a Q&A further. I think by and large, I've covered it. I would once again request you, if you have time, would you please respond to those questions, if at all anything I've missed out in my bundling up. Thank you so much, and over to you, Jeffrey, for your final conclusion.
Thank you, Graeme. This was an excellent presentation. It's one of many I have seen over the years. And I hope we could invite you to Upasi. And I was just speaking to Ravin, you know, whether we could have a nutrition farming course in Upasi over 3-4 days. I would like to invite you for that, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. And thank you all for joining this today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Chair. You did a great job there.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Looking forward to meet you.
Nice
Thanks
to talk
for all the coordination, Ajay. Well done.
Yep, thank you.
Nice to talk to you all, and I'm happy to help wherever I can. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.